Richer, wiser, happier. How the world's greatest investors win in markets and life. William Green. The laws of investing. When Pabrai discovers a subject that fascinates him, he attacks it with obsessive fervor. In Buffett's case, the available resources seemed limitless, including decades of letters to Berkshire's shareholders and seminal books such as Roger Lowenstein's Buffett, The Making of an American Capitalist. Pabrai devoured it all. He also began to make a pilgrimage each year to Omaha for Berkshire's annual meeting, showing up without fail for more than 20 years. Eventually, Pabrai would develop a personal relationship with Buffett. Through Buffett, he'd also become friends with Munger, who invites him for meals at his home, in Lowe's Angels and games of bridge at his club. But in those early days, Pabrai's knowledge came entirely from reading. And the more he read, the more convinced he became that Buffett, with Munger's help, had laid out the laws of investing, which are as fundamental as the laws of physics. Buffett's style of investing seemed so simple and so powerful that Pabrai considered it the only way to invest. But when he studied other money managers, he was perplexed to find that almost none lived by Buffett's laws. It was like meeting an entire set of physicists who don't believe in gravity. Whether you believe in gravity or not, it's fucking gonna pull you down. It was clear to Pabrai that most fund managers owned too many stocks, paid too much for them, and traded them too often. These mutual funds are sitting there with 1,000 positions or 200 positions. How can you find 200 companies that will all double? Then I look at what they own, and they own things that are trading at 30 times earnings. I saw that they were all hosed. Pabrai had read a book by the management guru Tom Peters that told a cautionary tale of two self-service gas stations on opposite sides of the street. One prospers by providing high-quality service, such as cleaning windshields for free. The other does the bare minimum. What happens? Its customers inevitably drift to the better gas station. This error amazed Pabrai, since nothing could have been easier than simply to copy the superior strategy sitting in plain view. Humans have something weird in their DNA which prohibits them from adopting good ideas easily, says Pabrai. What I learned a long time back is, keep observing the world inside and outside your industry, and when you see someone doing something smart, force yourself to adopt it. This sounds so obvious, even trite. But this one habit has played a decisive role in his success. So with the zeal of a true disciple, Pabrai committed to invest the way Warren said I should. Given that Buffett had averaged 31% a year, Pabrai naively assumed that it shouldn't be hard to average 26%. At that rate, his $1 million would double every 3 years and hit $1 billion in 30 years. As a reminder of this compounding target, his license plate reads COMLB 26. Even if he missed by a mile, he expected to do fine. If, say, he averaged 16% a year, his $1 million would turn into $85.85 million in 30 years. Such is the glory of compounding. Of course, he had no MBA from a fancy school such as Wharton or Columbia, no qualification as a certified financial analyst, no experience on Wall Street. But Pabrai, who regards his entire life as a game, expected his rigorous application of Buffett's methodology to give him an edge over all of the fools who failed to follow the sage of Omaha. I want to play games that I know I can win, says Pabrai. So how do you win the game? You've got to play according to the rules. And the good news is, I'm playing against players who don't even fucking know the rules. As Pabrai saw it, Buffett's approach to stock picking grew out of 3 core concepts that he'd learned from Benjamin Graham, the patron saint of value investing, who taught Buffett at Columbia and later hired him. First, whenever you buy a stock, you're purchasing a portion of an ongoing business with an underlying value, not just a piece of paper for speculators to trade. Second, Graham viewed the market as a voting machine, not a weighing machine, which means that stock prices frequently fail to reflect the true value of these businesses. As Graham wrote in The Intelligent Investor, it's useful to think of the market as a manic depressive who often lets his enthusiasm or his fears run away with him. Third, you should buy a stock only when it's selling for much less than your conservative estimate of its worth. The gap between a company's intrinsic value and its stock price provides what Graham called a margin of safety. But what does all of this mean in practical terms? Graham's insight that Mr. Market is prone to irrational mood swings has profound implications. For master investors such as Buffett and Munger, the essence of the game is to detach themselves from the madness and watch dispassionately until the bipolar market provides them with what Munger calls a mispriced gamble. There are no prizes for frenetic activity. Rather, investing is mostly a matter of waiting for these rare moments, when the odds of making money vastly outweigh the odds of losing it. As Buffett has said, you don't have to swing at everything, you can wait for your pitch. The problem when you're a money manager is that your fans keep yelling, "Swing, you bum." Sublimely indifferent to the cries of the crowd, Buffett can twiddle his thumbs for years. For example, he bought almost nothing from 1970 to 1972, when euphoric investors drove stocks to crazy valuations. Then, when the market crashed in 1973, he bought a major stake in the Washington Post Company, which he held for 4 decades. In his classic article, The Super Investors of Graham and Doddsville, Buffett wrote that the market valued the company at $80 million when you could have sold the assets to any one of 10 buyers for not less than $400 million. You don't try and buy businesses worth $83 million for $80 million. You leave yourself an enormous margin. When you build a bridge, you insist it can carry 30,000 pounds, but you only drive 10,000-pound trucks across it. And that same principle works in investing. In our hyperactive world, few people recognize the superiority of this slow and discerning strategy, which requires infrequent but decisive bursts of activity. Munger, a nonagenarian whom Pabrai considers the brightest human he's ever met, embodies this approach. Munger once observed, "You have to be like a man standing with a spear next to a stream. Most of the time he's doing nothing. When a fat, juicy salmon swims by, the man spears it. Then he goes back to doing nothing. It may be 6 months before the next salmon goes by. Few money managers function this way. Instead, says Pabrai, they place many bets, small bets and frequent bets. The trouble is, there aren't enough compelling opportunities to justify all of this activity. So Pabrai, like his 2 idols, prefers to wait for the most succulent salmon. During a conversation in his office in Irvine, he says, "The number one skill in investing is patience, extreme patience." When the market crashed in 2008, he made 10 investments in 2 months. In more typical times, he bought just 2 stocks in 2011, 3 in 2012, and none in 2013. In 2018, Pabrai's offshore hedge fund owned no U.S. stocks at all because nothing seemed cheap enough. Just think about that for a moment. Out of roughly 3,700 companies listed on the major U.S. exchanges, Pabrai couldn't find a single irresistible bargain. Instead of settling for American stocks that seemed richly valued, he took his fishing spear to better-stocked waters in India, China, and South Korea. As Munger likes to say, there are 2 rules of fishing. Rule no. 1. Fish where the fish are. Rule no. 2. Don't forget rule no. 1. Then, in the spring of 2020, the U.S. market crashed as the COVID-19 virus spread terror among investors. The retail industry was ravaged, with stores forced to close indefinitely and consumers required to stay home in lockdown mode. One company at the epicenter of uncertainty was Seritage Growth Properties, whose tenants included many retailers that could no longer afford to pay their rent. "The market hates all of this near-term noise and pain," says Pabrai. He exploited the panic to buy a 13% stake in Seritage at exceptional prices, figuring that he'll ultimately make 10 times his money as fears recede and others recognize the value of its prime assets. IV. Buffett, Munger, and Pabrai are not alone in pursuing this strategy of extreme patience and extreme selectivity. Their elite cohort includes great investors such as Francis Chu, one of Canada's most prominent fund managers. When I first interviewed him in 2014, Chu had 30% of his assets in cash and hadn't made a significant stock purchase in years. "When there's hardly anything to buy, you have to be very careful," he told me. "You cannot force the issue. You just have to be patient, and the bargains will come to you." He warned, if you want to participate in the market all the time, then it's a mug's game and you're going to lose. How long can he go without buying? "Oh, I can wait 10 years, even longer," Chu replied. In the meantime, he studies stocks that aren't cheap enough to buy, hits balls at a golf range, and reads 200 to 400 pages a day. One technique that he uses to distance himself emotionally from the day-to-day drama of the market is to think of himself in the third person instead of the first person. Like Chu, Pabrai has constructed a lifestyle that supports this heroically inactive investment strategy. When I visited his office in Irvine, he was dressed in shorts, sneakers, and a short-sleeved shirt. He looked less like an adrenaline-fueled stock jockey than a vacationer contemplating a lazy stroll on the beach. Cloning Buffett, who once showed him the blank pages of his little black diary, Pabrai keeps his calendar virtually empty so he can spend most of his time reading and studying companies. On a typical day at the office, he schedules a grand total of 0 meetings and 0 phone calls. One of his favorite quotes is from the philosopher Blaise Pascal: "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." One challenge, says Pabrai, is that large motors aren't good at grinding away without resulting actions. He thinks Berkshire Hathaway's shareholders have profited immensely from Buffett's passion for playing online bridge, since this mental distraction counteracts the natural bias for action. Pabrai plays online bridge, too, and he burns off energy by biking and playing racquetball. When there's nothing to buy and no reason to sell, he can also direct more attention to his charitable foundation. He says it helps that his investment staff consists of a single person, him. The moment you have people on your team, they're going to want to act and do things, and then you're hosed. In most fields, a hunger for action is a virtue. But as Buffett said at Berkshire's 1998 annual meeting, we don't get paid for activity, just for being right. Pabrai, a loner with a misanthropic streak, was purpose-built for the bizarrely lucrative discipline of sitting alone in a room and occasionally buying a mispriced stock. Back when he ran a tech company, he hired 2 industrial psychologists to profile him. They revealed how comically ill-suited he was to managing a large staff. "I'm not this nurturing leader who can have a bunch of weepies and nurture them and babysit them and all this other shit." Investing felt more like a game of 3-dimensional chess, in which the outcome, crucially, depended solely on him. Say no to almost everything. One of Pabrai's first stock picks was a tiny Indian technology company, Satyam Computer Services, which he bought in 1995. He understood the business, since he worked in the same industry and the stock was ultra-cheap. Pabrai watched in wonder as it rose about 140 times in 5 years. He sold in 2000 when it was outrageously overvalued and pocketed a $1.5 million profit. The late 90s tech bubble then burst, and the stock dropped more than 80%. Amused by his good fortune, Pabrai cheerfully likens himself to Forrest Gump, who made a killing in some kind of fruit company, namely Apple Computer. Through a combination of luck and smarts, Pabrai turned his $1 million into $10 million in less than 5 years. Aware that he had more to learn, he wrote to Buffett offering to work for him for free. Buffett replied, "I've given a lot of thought to the optimal use of my time, and I simply do best operating by myself." So Pabrai pursued Plan B. Several friends had profited from his stock tips, and they wanted him to manage their money. In 1999, he launched an investment partnership with $900,000 from 8 people and $100,000 of his own. A year or so later, he sold his technology consulting company, Transtech, for $6 million so that he could focus exclusively on investing. From 1956 to 1969, Buffett had managed investment partnerships with spectacular success. So Pabrai did what came naturally. He cloned every detail of Buffett's partnership model. For example, Buffett charged no annual management fee, but collected a performance fee of 25% of any profits over an annual hurdle of 6%. If he made a return of 6% or less, he didn't get paid a dime. But outsized returns would be richly rewarded. Pabrai adopted the same fee structure, reasoning that this alignment of interests made it an honorable way to do business. As it happens, Buffett had borrowed this fee structure from Graham, who used it in the 1920s. No stranger to cloning, Buffett has said, "If you learn basically from other people, you don't have to get too many ideas on your own. You can just apply the best of what you see." Part of the challenge is to discern the best and jettison the rest, instead of blindly cloning everything. For example, Graham was a devout believer in diversification, whereas Buffett got rich by focusing his bets on a much smaller number of undervalued stocks. This is an important point. Buffett borrowed liberally, but he adapted and refined Graham's practices to suit his own preferences. Following Buffett's lead, Pabrai constructed an unusually concentrated portfolio. He figured that 10 stocks would give him all the diversification he needed. When you're buying so few stocks, you can afford to be choosy. Pabrai glances at hundreds of stocks and rapidly rejects almost all of them, often in less than a minute. Buffett is a master of this practice of high-speed sifting. What he's looking for is a reason to say no, and as soon as he finds that, he's done, says Pabrai. Indeed, Buffett has said, the difference between successful people and really successful people is that really successful people say no to almost everything. Buffett provided Pabrai with several simple filters that helped him to streamline the sifting. First, says Pabrai, one of Buffett's core commandments is that you can invest in a company only if it falls within your circle of competence. When Pabrai analyzes a company, he starts by asking, "Is this something I truly understand?" He pushes himself to consider whether he's at the center of his circle of competence, approaching its edge, or outside it. Second, the company has to trade at a large enough discount to its underlying value to provide a significant margin of safety. Pabrai doesn't bother to construct elaborate Excel spreadsheets that might give him an illusion that he can precisely predict the future. He wants an investment that's so cheap that it's a no-brainer. That usually means paying less than 50 cents for $1 worth of assets. I have very simple criteria. If something is not going to be an obvious double in a short period of time, 2 or 3 years, I have no interest. Third, under Munger's influence, Buffett gradually shifted away from stocks that were merely cheap toward an emphasis on buying better businesses. Among other things, this meant that a company should have a durable competitive advantage and should be run by an honest, capable CEO. Munger pointed out to Pabrai that Graham, who was fixated on buying stocks that were quantitatively cheap, scored his best returns by owning GEICO. It didn't make him money because it was cheap, says Pabrai. It made him money because it was a great business. Fourth, the company's financial statements should be clear and simple. As Buffett observed, the only reason that one may not understand a financial statement is because the writer does not want you to understand it. If it isn't easy to figure out how the business generates cash today, and roughly how much it's likely to generate in the years to come, Buffett relegates it to what he calls the too hard pile. Pabrai once took a photograph of a box on Buffett's desk that is literally labeled too hard, a visual reminder to resist the lure of complexity. Enron and Valent Pharmaceuticals, both of which blew up, were easy for Pabrai to reject on that basis alone. For Pabrai, one of the secrets of successful investing is to avoid anything that's too hard. He automatically passes on investments in countries such as Russia and Zimbabwe, given their contempt for shareholder rights. He avoids all startups and initial public offerings, IPOs, since he's unlikely to find bargains in arenas dominated by sales hype and inflated expectations. He has never sold a stock short because the maximum upside is 100% if the stock falls to zero, while the downside is unlimited if the stock soars. Why bet with those odds? He asks. He also largely ignores the infinite complexity of macroeconomics, focusing instead on a handful of critical microfactors that are likely to drive a specific business. In short, simplicity rules. These basic principles that we've just discussed are extraordinarily robust and have served Pabrai well. But what's remarkable is that none of this is original. Every major idea on which he has built his investment career has been stolen from Buffett, except for the one stolen from Munger. Writing about this makes me slightly queasy. How can I hope to say anything new or profound while enumerating ideas that Pabrai has ripped off from other people? But that's precisely the point. His competitive advantage lies in the fact that he doesn't care whether you or I think he's derivative. All he cares about is what works. One evening, over dinner at a Korean restaurant in Irvine, I asked Pabrai why more people don't clone in his systematic way. Between mouthfuls of a dish called spicy beef danger, he replies, they're not as shameless as me. They have more ego. To be a great cloner, you have to check your ego at the door. The guru, his disciple, and their $650,100 lunch. Pabrai's purloined investment approach worked like a dream. When he launched Pabrai Funds in July 1999, the tech bubble was about to burst. It was a perilous time to be an investor. Over the next 8 years, the best-performing U.S. index, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, eked out an annualized return of 4.6% versus Pabrai's annualized return of 29.4% after fees. The media hailed him as a superstar, the next Warren Buffett, and the Oracle of Irvine. His assets under management swelled to $600 million. He recalls, I could do nothing wrong. Pabrai's returns were driven by a string of bets on undervalued stocks gripped by uncertainty. For example, he invested in Embraer, a Brazilian producer of jets, shortly after the 9/11 terror attacks, which caused many airlines to cancel aircraft orders. This short-term shock led fearful investors to overlook the longer-term reality that Embraer was still a high-quality business with a superior product, low manufacturing costs, first-rate management, and loads of cash on its balance sheet. Pabrai paid about $12 per share in 2001 and sold his last shares for $30 in 2005. Similarly, in 2002, he invested in a Scandinavian shipping firm, Frontline Limited, after the price for leasing oil tankers collapsed. The stock had plunged to $5.90, but he calculated that Frontline's liquidation value was more than $11 per share. Leasing prices would eventually rebound, since supply would become constrained. In the meantime, Frontline could survive a cash crunch by selling ships one by one. As with Embrar, uncertainty scared investors away. But the upside potential easily outweighed the downside risk. Pabrai coined a motto that summed up this type of bet: heads, I win. Tails, I don't lose much. In a matter of months, he made a 55% return. In 2005, he bet heavily on another no-brainer, a specialty steel producer called IPSCO Inc. Pabrai paid around $44 per share at a time when the company had about $15 per share of excess cash on its books. He expected IPSCO to generate around $13 per share of excess cash in each of the next 2 years, giving it a total of $41 per share in cash. With the stock trading at $44, he was effectively buying all of IPSCO's steel plants and other assets for only $3 per share. Pabrai couldn't predict what the company would earn beyond the next 2 years, but as he saw it, the stock was so cheap that there was scant risk of losing money. When he sold in 2007, his $24.7 million investment was worth $87.2 million, a 253% return in 26 months. In recent years, it's become almost an article of faith that it's impossible to beat the market over the long run. But Pabrai, thanks to Buffett and Munger, had found a formula for outperformance. As we've seen, the key principles were not that difficult to identify and clone. Be patient and selective, saying no to almost everything. Exploit the market's bipolar mood swings. Buy stocks at a big discount to their underlying value. Stay within your circle of competence. Avoid anything too hard. Make a small number of mispriced bets with minimal downside and significant upside. Yet Pabrai was almost alone in his fanatical determination to observe these rules. Nobody else is willing to do this, he marvels. It might as well be the Indian guy. Pabrai wanted to express his gratitude in person. So in July 2007, he teamed up with his best friend, Guy Spear, to enter a charity auction for a power lunch with Buffett. VII Pabrai and Spear, a Zurich-based hedge fund manager who is similarly obsessed with Buffett, won the auction with a bid of $650,100. The money would go to the Glide Foundation, a charity that helps the homeless. But Pabrai saw the donation as his version of a Guru Dakshana, a Hindu term for a gift presented to your spiritual teacher when your education is complete. On June 25, 2008, Pabrai finally met his guru. They spent 3 hours together at a Manhattan steakhouse, Smith and Wolinski, ensconced in a wood-paneled alcove at the back of the restaurant. Pabrai brought his wife, Harina, and their 2 daughters, Monsoon and Mamachi, who sat on either side of Buffett. VII Spear brought his wife, Lori. Buffett, who was jovial and grandfatherly, brought bags of gifts for the kids, including M&Ms with his picture on them. The conversation ranged from his favorite company, GEICO, to the person he'd most like to meet, either Sir Isaac Newton, who was probably the smartest human in history, or Sophia Loren, for less cerebral reasons. For Pabrai, the lunch yielded 2 unforgettable lessons, one about how to invest, one about how to live. The first came when he asked Buffett, whatever happened to Rick Guerin? Buffett had mentioned Guerin's superb investment record in The Super Investors of Graham and Doddsville. But Buffett told Pabrai and Spear that Guerin used margin loans to leverage his investments because he was in a hurry to get rich. According to Buffett, Guerin was hit with margin calls after suffering disastrous losses in the crash of 1973-74. As a result, he was forced to sell shares to Buffett that were later worth an immense fortune. IX. By contrast, Buffett said that he and Munger were never in a hurry because they always knew they'd become enormously rich if they kept compounding over decades without too many catastrophic mistakes. Over his meal of steak, hash browns, and a cherry Coke, Buffett said, "If you're even a slightly above average investor who spends less than you earn, over a lifetime you cannot help but get very wealthy." Pabrai says this morality tale about the perils of leverage and impatience has been seared into his brain. Right there, the Buffett lunch was worth it. But what resonated most profoundly for Pabrai was the sense that Buffett was true to himself, that he lived in extraordinary alignment with his own personality, principles, and preferences. Over lunch, Buffett explained that he and Munger always measure themselves by an inner scorecard. Instead of worrying how others judge them, they focus on living up to their own exacting standards. One way to tell whether you live by an inner or an outer scorecard, said Buffett, is to ask yourself, would I rather be the worst lover in the world and be known publicly as the best, or the best lover in the world and be known publicly as the worst? Buffett manages every aspect of his life in ways that mesh with his own nature, from his childish diet, which consists largely of burgers, candy, and Coca-Cola, to how he runs his business. For example, he made it clear that Berkshire's decentralized structure was never designed to maximize profits. It simply suited his character to oversee Berkshire's many businesses in a hands-off manner, trusting his CEOs to use their freedom wisely. Likewise, he pointed out that he handles his own daily schedule and keeps it blissfully uncluttered by rebuffing almost any request that might distract him from reading and contemplation. Similarly, he insists on working solely with people he likes and admires. As a stock picker, too, he has always gone his own way, avoiding whatever overvalued asset class is currently in vogue. This discussion had an enduring impact on Pabrai and Speer. In May 2014, I joined them at Berkshire's annual meeting. The next day, we flew from Omaha to New York on a private plane that Speer had chartered from NetJets, a Berkshire subsidiary. He and Pabrai had just come from a breakfast with Buffett and Munger and were giddily happy. During the flight, our main topic of conversation was this notion of living by an inner scorecard. As Pabrai saw it, probably 99% of people on this planet wonder what the world thinks of them. A tiny minority take the opposite view, which he poetically expressed as follows: "Fuck what the world thinks." Pabrai and Speer reeled off a random list of inner scorecard exemplars: Jesus, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Margaret Thatcher, Steve Jobs, and leading investors such as Buffett, Munger, Ted Weschler, Lee Lu, Bill Miller, and Nick Sleep, whom we'll study in depth in Chapter 6. Pabrai observed, "All the guys who reach the pinnacle, that's the only way they got there. Nobody I've ever met lives more determinedly by his own rules than Pabrai." Buffett's example strengthened his commitment to construct a life congruent with his personality. On a typical day, Pabrai sleeps late and arrives at his office after 10:00 a.m. with no agenda. An assistant brings him printouts of his emails around 11:00 a.m. And Pabrai scrawls the briefest of replies directly on the paper, a practice cloned from Munger. Like Buffett and Munger, Pabrai spends most of the day reading. He takes a guiltless nap most afternoons, then resumes reading until late in the evening. As much as possible, Pabrai remains inside this cocoon. He avoids meeting the CEOs of companies that he's analyzing because he thinks their talent for selling makes them an unreliable source of information, a policy he cloned from Ben Graham. He avoids speaking with his own shareholders except at his annual meeting, and he refuses to meet with potential investors. I genuinely don't enjoy that whole interaction, the mumbo-jumbo of all that. It doesn't bother him if this attitude irritates people or costs him millions of dollars a year in foregone fees. Munger says he doesn't care about being rich. What he really cares about is having independence. I fully endorse that. What the money gives you is the ability to do what you want to do in the way you want to do it. And that's a tremendous benefit. Pabrai approaches relationships with the same ruthless clarity about his own priorities. During their lunch, Buffett said, "Hang out with people who are better than you and you cannot help but improve." Pabrai acts on this advice to a degree that would horrify many people. When I meet someone for the first time, I evaluate them afterwards and say, will it make me better or worse to have a relationship with this person? If the answer is worse, he says, I'll cut him out. Likewise, after a lunch meeting, he asks, how did I enjoy that? If he didn't, there will never be another lunch with the person again. He adds, most people don't pass the smell test. Diplomacy is not his strong point, but Pabrai regards truthfulness as a higher concern. In the late 90s, he read a book titled Power vs. Force, The Hidden Determinants of Human Behavior by David Hawkins, which Pabrai describes as a huge part of what I believe in. Hawkins argues that true power stems from traits such as honesty, compassion, and a dedication to enhancing other people's lives. These powerful attractors have an unconscious effect on people, making them go strong, whereas traits such as dishonesty, fear, and shame make them go weak. Pabrai took one specific lesson from Hawkins and determined to live by it. You can't get away with lying to other humans, says Pabrai, and that's a very profound idea. During the financial crisis of 2008-09, Pabrai's highly concentrated funds fell about 67% before staging a rapid recovery. At his 2009 annual meeting, he told his shareholders, most of the mistakes in the funds occurred because I was stupid. They didn't happen because of market issues. He highlighted several dumbass errors he had made in analyzing stocks such as Delta Financial and Sears Holdings, which were crushed. Almost none of his investors abandoned him. The lesson: you go as far out as you can on the truth variable and the payback is huge. Indeed, one of the pleasures of interviewing Pabrai is that he answers every question candidly, with no concern for how he might be judged. As an experiment, I once emailed him some impertinently personal questions, including one about his net worth. He wrote back, net worth as of 11/30/17 is $154 million. He then shared additional financial detail to clarify what this figure excluded. It was a marvelous display of trust in the power of truthfulness. To my mind, what's most remarkable is Pabrai's unshakable consistency in sticking to such principles. When you encounter these truths that other people don't understand, you just have to latch on to them big time, he says. Anytime you get a truth that humanity doesn't understand, that's a huge competitive advantage. Humanity doesn't understand power vs. Force. Intelligent people are easily seduced by complexity, while underestimating the importance of simple ideas that carry tremendous weight. Pabrai, the ultimate pragmatist, doesn't fall into this trap. Compounding is a very simple idea. Cloning is a very simple idea. Telling the truth is a very simple idea, he says. But when you apply a handful of powerful ideas with obsessive fervor, the cumulative effect becomes unbeatable. The trouble is, most people dabble half-heartedly when they find an idea that works. Pabrai cannot conceal his contempt. These fucking humans listen and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Whatever. So what? I'll try to incorporate it. And you know that fucking doesn't work. You've got to go 10,000% or not at all. As he sees it, the attitude we should clone is that of the 19th century Hindu sage Swami Vivekananda, who told his followers, "Take up one idea. Make that one idea your life. Think of it, dream of it, live on that idea. Let the brain, muscles, nerves, every part of your body be full of that idea and just leave every other idea alone. This is the way to success." XI. Welcome to the kidnapping capital of India. As Pabrai's fortune grew, he faced a pleasurable problem: what to do with all the money. Once again, he turned to Buffett for inspiration. Over the years, Buffett has repeatedly spoken about how little his wealth contributes to his contentment. I remember sitting with Pabrai and Spear at one of Berkshire's annual meetings when Buffett told the audience, "My life would be worse if I had 6 or 8 houses. It just doesn't correlate." Pabrai is not exactly ascetic. He once spent thousands of dollars on a pair of bespoke shoes, and he drives a blue convertible Ferrari, a fitting reward for a huge home run on Ferrari stock. But he knows that hedonism is an unreliable route to happiness. He's also wary of bequeathing hundreds of millions to his daughters, having internalized Buffett's advice that the ideal amount to give your kids is enough so they can do anything, but not so much that they can do nothing. Buffett had pledged to give the bulk of his billions back to society, so Pabrai decided to clone the giving. He began by asking, "If I were to die today, what cause or organization would I want most of my assets to go to?" He wanted a charity managed like a cost-efficient business, with precise metrics tracking how much good it did for every dollar spent. Nothing excited him until, in 2006, he stumbled on an article about a program in rural India run by Anand Kumar, a math teacher who gave free coaching and accommodation to 30 poor high school graduates each year. The Super 30 program had an incredible success rate in preparing them for the IIT entrance exam. Pabrai grasped at once the strength of this model. It was low cost, offered talented teenagers a life-changing chance to escape from poverty, and provided measurable results. He emailed Kumar, offering him money to enlarge the program. But Kumar didn't want to expand. Undeterred, Pabrai made a fateful decision. "You gotta take a trip and just show up." Bihar, which was often described as the kidnapping capital of India, wasn't an alluring destination for a high-flying hedge fund manager. So Pabrai hired 2 bodyguards from a new Delhi security firm to accompany him on his mission. One was a former Black Cat commando, an Indian counterterrorism specialist, trained to storm hijacked aircraft and take the kidnapper out. From being asleep to killing the guy was less than 3 seconds. The commando had to travel separately by train to Bihar because he couldn't carry his gun on the plane. It later turned out that Kumar had also hired 4 bodyguards to ensure Pabrai's safety. Pabrai found Bihar a desolate and desperate place, where thieves would sometimes steal railway tracks and sell them for scrap. His grumpy verdict: "The weather sucks, the infrastructure sucks, the hotel sucks." Pabrai harbors fantasies of becoming so enlightened that he could happily stay in 1-star hotels. Alas, he's not there yet. Still, despite the discomfort, he would never forget the day he spent with Kumar, who taught his students in a rented shed without walls. Pabrai was blown away by his intellect, passion, and gift for teaching. He's one in hundreds of millions. Unable to convince Kumar to take his money, Pabrai requested permission to replicate and scale up the Super 30 program. His appropriation of Buffett's investment strategy had proven to him the power of cloning. So why not apply the same approach to philanthropy? Kumar gave him his blessing, and Pabrai set to work. Kumar's renown meant that thousands of students applied to his program. He then handpicked the most brilliant. Pabrai solved the problem of sourcing brainiacs by partnering with a government-run network of almost 600 selective boarding schools, which educate tens of thousands of poor rural children each year. Pabrai's Dakshana Foundation offered scholarships to hundreds of the most promising brains from this pool and gave them 2 years of coaching in math, physics, and chemistry to prepare for the IIT exam. If they don't bust their asses, they're going back to the villages with nothing, says Pabrai. This is their one shot. The strength of this philanthropic model is that it costs so little to change so many lives. In 2008, Dakshana's total cost per scholar was $3,913, and 34% of its students won places at IIT. By 2016, Dakshana had become so efficient that its cost per student had dropped to $2,649, and its success rate hit an astonishing 85%. Even better, the government heavily subsidizes both the boarding schools and IIT. Pabrai figures that for every dollar Dakshana spends on a student, the government spends more than $1,000. So he's effectively making a leveraged bet with an enormous social return on his invested capital. XII. Before meeting Buffett for lunch in 2008, Pabrai sent him Dakshana's first annual report. Buffett was so impressed that he shared it with Munger and Bill Gates. Then, in an interview with Fox TV, Buffett declared that Pabrai thinks as well about philanthropy as he does about investments. I admire him enormously. The disciple, the shameless copycat, had been blessed by the master. After that, says Pabrai, I felt that I could die and go to heaven. Since then, Dakshana has grown exponentially. By 2018, it was coaching more than 1,000 students simultaneously at 8 sites across India, including a 109-acre campus called Dakshana Valley, which Pabrai bought at a discount from a distressed seller. Eventually, this site alone could accommodate 2,600 students. Meanwhile, Dakshana has broadened its focus beyond IIT. It now also prepares hundreds of poverty-stricken students for the entrance exam to medical schools. In 2019 alone, 164 Dakshana scholars won places to study medicine, a 64% success rate. All of these initiatives are managed by Dakshana's CEO, a retired artillery officer named Colonel Ram Sharma, who charges 1 rupee per year for his services. XII. In other words, what began as a humble replica of Kumar's program has become a behemoth, a testament to the fact that intelligent cloning involves more than crude imitation. In Dakshana's case, Pabrai borrowed a model that worked in miniature and rebuilt it on an industrial scale. His success is because of his attention to detail, says Colonel Sharma. I can definitely say that. XIV. When Pabrai and I traveled to Dakshana Valley, we met with Ashok Talapatra, one of the Foundation's star alumni. Talapatra told me that he grew up in a $6 per month shack in a slum in Hyderabad as the son of a tailor who earned $100 a month. Their home was so basic that it had a pink shower curtain instead of a front door and an asbestos roof that failed to keep out the rain. When Pabrai and his daughter, Monsoon, visited Talapatra there, his mother served them chai and snacks on top of a stool because the family didn't own a table. But Talapatra was a brilliant student. He aced the IIT entrance exam, ranking 63rd out of 471,000 applicants, the highest position that any Dakshana scholar had ever achieved. He went on to study computer science and engineering at IIT Bombay, then landed a 6-figure job at Google. After a stint in London, he moved to the company's headquarters in California, where he now works as a software engineer. He's moving up the ranks, says Pabrai. He's on a very rapid trajectory. Within a year of joining Google, Talapatra bought his parents a new apartment with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, air conditioning, and an impermeable roof. Talapatra's remarkable journey hasn't stopped there. Inspired by Pabrai, who has become a friend and mentor, he's increasingly fascinated by investing. Pabrai recommends investment books to him, and Talapatra regularly joins him at Berkshire Hathaway's annual meeting. When I see them together in Omaha and consider the impact that Pabrai has had on Talapatra's life, I'm amazed that one man's knack for betting on mispriced stocks has produced so much good. In sentimental moments, I find myself thinking of the Talmudic saying, "Whoever saves one life, it is considered as if he saved the whole world." But Pabrai, in his brutally honest way, ridicules any notion that he's some sort of righteous savior. While sitting in a taxi in Mumbai, he tells me, "Once you have a sense that life is meaningless, what should you do? Not fuck up life for other people. Leave the planet a better place than you found it. Do a good job with your kids. The rest of it is a game. It doesn't matter." Lessons from Monish. After many conversations with Pabrai, I found myself thinking more and more about the power of cloning and how to use it in my own life. On a plane ride home from Irvine, I even wrote a memo to myself entitled Lessons from Monish. It began with two fundamental questions. What winning habits are out in the open that I should clone, and who should I clone? For example, it makes sense for me, as a nonfiction writer, to reverse engineer books by authors I admire, such as Michael Lewis, Malcolm Gladwell, and Oliver Sacks. XV. As I considered Pabrai's life and what I should learn from him, several principles particularly resonated with me. In my memo I wrote, Rule 1, clone like crazy. Rule 2, hang out with people who are better than you. Rule 3, treat life as a game, not as a survival contest or a battle to the death. Rule 4, be in alignment with who you are. Don't do what you don't want to do or what's not right for you. Rule 5, live by an inner scorecard. Don't worry about what others think of you. Don't be defined by external validation. Finally, quoting a line of Munger's that Pabrai often cites, I wrote, take a simple idea and take it seriously. Of all these lessons, that last one might just be the most important. Too often, we encounter a powerful principle or habit and we contemplate it, take it for a quick spin, and then forget about it. Pabrai becomes consumed by it. He lives by it. That's a habit I have to clone. But the goal here isn't to become a slavish follower of someone else's ideas. It's often smarter to take the spirit of a principle and adapt it to suit our own priorities. For example, I kept thinking about Pabrai's fixation on going as far out as you can on the truth variable. That led me to wonder, what if you were to focus instead on going as far out as you can on the kindness variable or the compassion variable? Pabrai's habit of focusing single-mindedly and without compromise on a specific virtue has real power, but we don't have to choose the same virtue. I think it also works best when we clone in ways that match our own talents and temperament. Pabrai and Speer often discuss companies before deciding whether to invest in them, a practice they cloned from Buffett and Munger. As a result, they tend to own many of the same stocks. But Speer's position sizes are significantly smaller because he's more cautious and less self-confident than Pabrai. As he puts it, I don't have balls of steel like Monish. In 2015, Pabrai had half of his fund's assets in just two investments, Fiat Chrysler and General Motors warrants. Speer, who had about a quarter of his assets in them, found Pabrai's level of concentration breathtakingly scary, and worried that he'd failed to protect his friend from hubris and overconfidence. Another hedge fund manager warned that Pabrai's overweighting of the auto sector was batshit crazy. But Pabrai made 7 times his money in 6 years as Fiat stock surged. Unrepentant, he had 70% of his offshore fund's assets in 2 stocks in 2018, a fearlessly aggressive stance that led to a 42% loss that year. As Speer once told me, The border between brilliance and stupidity is hard to discern. Pabrai's strategy of extreme concentration is influenced by Munger, who has said that a well-diversified portfolio needs just 4 stocks. But it would be suicidal for you or me to clone that approach unless we share Pabrai's extreme intestinal fortitude and analytical gifts. When I asked him how he coped with the stress of a 67% drawdown during the financial crisis of 2008-09, he said, "I don't have stress. My wife couldn't even detect that there was an issue." On the contrary, the stocks he bought amid the crash were so cheap that he found the experience orgasmic. Psychologically, it also helps that Pabrai doesn't take anything too seriously. He once told me, "On my gravestone I want them to write, he loved to play games, especially games he knew he could win. Cloning is a game. Blackjack is a game. Bridge is a game. Dakshana is a game. And of course, the stock market is a game. It's just a bunch of games. It's all about the odds." What's amazing to Pabrai is how easy it's been to stack those odds in his favor by studying other people's playbooks and consistently borrowing their best moves. "The thing is, none of this stuff is hard," he says with an exuberant laugh. "Don't spill the beans, man. Don't tell the world." Chapter 2: The Willingness to be Lonely. To beat the market, you must be brave enough, independent enough, and strange enough to stray from the crowd. It is impossible to produce superior performance unless you do something different from the majority. Sir John Templeton. Walking along a beach in the Bahamas more than 20 years ago, I stumbled upon a peculiar sight. An old man was immersed up to his neck in the ocean, dressed in a long-sleeved shirt and a ridiculous-looking hat with a visor and ear flaps. His face was smothered with thick dollops of sun cream. I ducked behind a palm tree so that he wouldn't catch me spying on him. Then I watched for several minutes while he pumped his arms and legs back and forth, power walking against the resistance of the water. I later discovered that he did this for 45 minutes each day. The old man was Sir John Templeton, probably the greatest international investor of the 20th century. I traveled from New York to the Bahamas to interview him in his home at the Lyford Key Club, a gated idyll whose residents have included Prince Rainier III of Monaco, the Aga Khan, and Sean Connery. But if my memory serves me, we weren't scheduled to meet until the following day. This was the kind of reporting trip that makes a journalist's heart sing, an interview with a fabled icon in an exotic location, with all expenses paid by a rich magazine that hadn't yet been clobbered by the advent of the Internet. Templeton had a spectacular investment record. The Templeton Growth Fund, which he'd founded in 1954, racked up an average annual return of 14.5% over 38 years. A $100,000 stake would have grown to more than $17 million in that time. Templeton, who was born in 1912 in a small town in rural Tennessee, had started out with nothing and ended up a billionaire. I wanted to know how he had done it and what the rest of us could learn from this act of alchemy. He was 85 at the time, the grand old man of the investment world, and I'd half expected him to look like a sage. Instead, I found myself spellbound by this unlikely image of him, marching through the surf in his comical hat. But as I would eventually realize, my glimpse of his fitness regimen provided an important insight into his greatness. Templeton had figured out an efficient way to exercise for free in a gorgeous setting. It was utterly irrelevant to him that anyone might think he looked strange, and this indifference was essential to his success. Michael Lipper, the president of an investment firm called Lipper Advisory Services, once remarked to me that Templeton, George Soros, and Warren Buffett shared one invaluable characteristic: the willingness to be lonely, the willingness to take a position that others don't think is too bright. They have an inner conviction that a lot of people do not have. That phrase, the willingness to be lonely, has stuck in my mind for many years. It eloquently conveys the critical idea that the best investors are not like other people. They are iconoclasts, mavericks, and misfits who see the world differently from the crowd and follow their own peculiar path, not just in the way they invest, but in the way they think and live. Francois Rachan, a Canadian money manager who has beaten the market by a mile over the last quarter of a century, has an intriguing theory. As we all know, the human genetic code developed over hundreds of thousands of years to support the primary objective of survival. One lesson we learned at least 200,000 years ago is that it's safer to belong to a tribe. That unconscious instinct tends to kick in almost irresistibly when we feel under threat, says Rachan. For example, when stocks plummet, the average investor sees others panicking and instinctively follows the tribe by selling stocks and fleeing to the safe haven of cash. What the tribe followers fail to recognize is the counterintuitive truth that this might be the perfect time to buy stocks, since they're now on sale. But I think some people in the race don't have that tribal gene, says Rachan, so they don't feel the urge to follow a tribe. And those people can become good investors because they can think for themselves. Rachan, who uses his talent for stock picking to bankroll his passion for collecting art, suspects that many artists, writers, and entrepreneurs also lack the tribal gene. Rachan's theory is entirely unprovable, but there's plenty of anecdotal evidence that the best investors are wired in unusual ways that may be financially advantageous. One famed investor who asked not to be quoted by name on this subject told me that many of his most successful peers are kind of Aspergerish, and that almost all are unemotional. He points out that it's a help to be unemotional when making unconventional bets that the crowd would consider foolish. He adds that people with developmental conditions such as Asperger's syndrome often have something else in compensation, and very often it's numeracy. Being unemotional and numerate is a great combination for investing. I mentioned this idea to another hugely successful fund manager who is mathematically gifted and extremely uncomfortable in social situations. He confided, "When I was a child, my parents were concerned that I was autistic or might have a touch of Asperger. I think they concluded no. Or at least, it wasn't damaging enough. So yeah, it might be that I'm slightly on the spectrum or not." He then recalled a devastating childhood trauma that also led him to distance himself from his emotions. So if you're thinking I'm a psycho chicken, you may be right. One of the most insightful perspectives on this subject comes from Christopher Davis, who oversees about $25 billion in assets at Davis Advisors, an investment firm founded by his father in 1969. He's unusually well-positioned to observe the idiosyncratic personalities of the most successful investors. He's friends with high-profile practitioners such as Buffett, Munger, Mason Hawkins, and Bill Miller. Moreover, his grandfather, Shelby Cullum Davis, and father, Shelby M.C. Davis, were both investment legends who amassed colossal fortunes in the stock market. A necessary characteristic of great investors is that they can't be overly influenced by what other people think, says Davis. The easiest way not to be overly influenced by what other people think is not to be that aware of what they think. If you don't really notice that, and don't really care about what other people think, that will make it easier to be a great investor. It follows, says Davis, that a prevalent characteristic in great investors would be low emotional intelligence. He observes that many of the best investors struggle when it comes to bonding with others and nurturing warm attachments in their family life. By contrast, says Davis, you tend to encounter an entirely different psychological profile among CEOs. They require the emotional intelligence to empathize with others, understand their thoughts, and influence them. But for a contrarian investor, it would be catastrophic if you were constantly burdened by an awareness of what everybody else was thinking about your decision. In their youth, he adds, many CEOs played team sports, captained a team, or led a fraternity. What about the best investors? By and large, says Davis, they favored individual sports such as running, tennis, golf, or swimming. You won't get a lot of football, lacrosse, that sort of thing. His father, now in his 80s, was one of the investment titans of his generation. During Shelby Davis's 28 years as manager of the New York Venture Fund, a $100,000 investment would have grown to about $3.8 million. So how did he fit the psychological profile painted by his son? My father was very deeply a loner, says Davis. I can't imagine him playing team sports, being president of a fraternity, or leading a nonprofit. He just was constantly looking for information, grilling people, and reading annual reports. It was a lonely sort of work. I mean, it was him at a telephone or him, and a stack of annual reports and quarterly reports. His description reminds me of Buffett's politely dismissive response to Mohnish Pabrai after the latter offered to work for him for free. I simply do best operating by myself. Indeed, Buffett famously spends much of his time sitting alone in his office in Omaha with the blinds drawn, enraptured by the solitary joy of reading annual reports. Beyond these broad patterns, there are plenty of exceptions and nuances. I'm not suggesting that all of the best investors have developmental disorders or lead lonely lives or are destined to divorce, though the list of divorced investment giants is certainly long, including Munger, Miller, Pabrai, Bill Ackman, Carl Icahn, David Einhorn, and countless others. That would be a gross exaggeration. Plus, it's inane to pathologize every quirk or eccentricity. Still, despite these caveats and disclaimers, I think it's true that all of the investors you'll meet in this book are non-tribal freethinkers. They have a rare capacity to defy conventional opinion. They care much more about being right and winning than gaining social acceptance or approval. Matthew McLennan, who oversees more than $100 billion at First Eagle Investment Management, describes his job this way. Every day you're trying to understand how the world works, bottom up, top down, and you're trying to synthesize it in a way that's different from the consensus. At the end of the day, we're paid to see the world through a different prism. The only way to beat the market is to diverge from the market. That's a task best suited to people who are, quite literally, extraordinary, both intellectually and temperamentally. So perhaps it's no surprise that this is a game that favors brilliant oddballs. And in my experience, nobody was more brilliant or odd than Sir John Templeton. A pioneer of global value investing, he figured out entirely for himself a set of principles and practices that can benefit any investor to this day. But looking back now, long after his death in 2008 at the age of 95, I realized that I failed to grasp the most valuable lessons of his life. The making of a maverick. It was the fall of 1998 when I met Templeton. Even then, a couple of weeks before his 86th birthday, he still showed up for work each day at his office in the city of Nassau, a short drive from his home. Our day together began in that office, where he greeted me in a genteel manner from a bygone era. "My time is at your discretion," he said, with a soft southern twang. "I'll stay as long as you need me." He was dressed in a pale yellow sports jacket, an open-necked shirt, and gray trousers without a belt. Small, lean, and tanned, he looked 15 years younger than his age. His office was filled with an unusual range of honors. There was an award for best performance by a mutual fund over 35 years, a trophy from PBS television to mark his induction in Louis Rucker's Wall Street Week Hall of Fame, an entire wall decorated with his honorary degrees, his award for International Churchman of the Year, and his Norman Vincent Peale Award for Positive Thinking. Templeton had moved to the Bahamas in the 1960s after a stint in New York. Abandoning his tribe, he renounced his U.S. passport, became a British citizen, and built a house in Lyford Key. He'd grown up in a devoutly Christian home in Winchester, Tennessee, and his deep-seated faith played a part in his decision to settle in the Bahamas. "This nation has more churches per person than anywhere else in the world," he informed me, "which makes it very attractive and harmonious." There was also the social allure of the exclusive Lyford Key Club. In general, the admissions committee has done a good job of keeping the really top people in the club. So this was a chance to spend our lives with really fascinating people. He mentioned Joseph Lewis, a commodities billionaire with the most magnificent yacht I've ever seen in my life, other than the Queen's yacht. "It's huge. He's very private, the kind of fellow we like to have here. He's not flamboyant. I've met him in parties. He just quietly does investment trading from his yacht or home." The club boasted its own marina, tennis courts, and beachfront golf course. But Templeton refused to indulge in such decadent frivolities. "My neighbors go out golfing and yachting and so forth. But my own viewpoint is that it's far more important to be useful," he said. "I've never thought it wise to pursue pleasure. There must have been some deeper reason why God created human beings. And one of the fairly obvious things is that the people who are busy with some really useful work are happier than the ones who are idle." He was equally adamant about the perils of retirement, which he disdained as deadly, both for the body and mind. As Templeton saw it, the misguided notion of retiring at 65 had created enormously increased numbers of idle people, useless people, who are a drag on civilization. It was my first view of this aspect of his character, a hard-edged, moralistic side that seemed at odds with his old-world charm and courtly manners. While others frittered away their lives, Templeton said he was the busiest he'd ever been. He had sold his investment firm for hundreds of millions of dollars a few years earlier. So he now devoted his time to philanthropy, overseeing the money in his charitable foundations, managing his personal fortune, and writing books with titles such as Worldwide Laws of Life, 200 Eternal Spiritual Principles. As we'll see, his gift for making immense sums of money never deserted him, but his primary passion had shifted to spreading what he called spiritual wealth. It was a characteristically unconventional crusade. For example, among his many philanthropic initiatives, Templeton spent millions funding scientific research at Harvard Medical School and elsewhere on whether prayer works. He excitedly listed for me some of the many questions he hoped to answer. Do the people who are prayed for get well quicker? Does the prayer work only if the person who is sick does the praying, or can it be done by somebody else? If it's done by somebody else, is it important that the person praying put his hands on the person prayed for? Do you pray for the cancer to disappear, or do you pray that God's will be done? Templeton also funded scientific studies that investigated the benefits of virtues such as forgiveness, humility, honesty, and love. He provided financial incentives for university professors to teach courses on how science reveals more about God. He also funded the Templeton Prize for Progress toward research or discoveries about spiritual realities, which rewarded entrepreneurs of the spirit for expanding our vision of human purpose and ultimate reality. Eager to emphasize that these ethereal matters are more important than worldly concerns, he structured the annual award so that it would always be more lucrative than the Nobel Prize. These days, the winner pockets £1.1 million, about $1.4 million. This was all part of Templeton's grandiose campaign to multiply spiritual information 100-fold. It was not an endeavor that everyone applauded. At one end of the spectrum, secular scientists were bemused by his interest in measuring experimentally the effects of spiritual principles. At the other extreme, religious conservatives were appalled by his free-spirited readiness to question their beliefs. He recalled a recent encounter with a nice lady who asked his opinion about the biblical story of Noah and the flood. He suggested that it was a useful allegory, but not literal truth. Her outraged response, "Well, you're not a Christian." When I asked impertinently if many people regarded him as a kook, Templeton replied, "Yes, sure. But I have more self-confidence than the average person." It struck me that this trait also lay at the heart of his success as an investor. Templeton agreed. When you're sticking your neck out, you have to be self-confident enough or brave enough to do it. I did that in the investment field, and I'm doing it now in the spiritual area. He attributed this attitude to his unusual upbringing. In all of my childhood, I can't remember either my mother or my father ever telling me, "Do this," or "Don't do that." They thought it would help me to become self-reliant and self-confident if I had to do everything myself. And boy, was that a marvelous education. It's the greatest gift, having to rely on yourself. On one occasion, his parents appointed him navigator on a family road trip. Templeton, still a young boy, misread the map and took them an hour or two in the wrong direction. Nobody corrected him. They simply waited until he figured out for himself that he'd made a mistake. This laissez-faire parenting strategy wasn't without its risks. When Templeton was about 8, his parents granted his request for a shotgun so he could go out hunting. They also allowed him to buy gunpowder for fireworks and cyanide for his butterfly-killing jars. Templeton took great pride in his self-reliance. After 11 years of scoring straight A's at school, he headed to Yale in 1930. Gutted by the Great Depression, his father, a lawyer and businessman, wrote to Templeton at the end of freshman year to say that he could no longer pay even $1 for his education. Templeton lined up part-time jobs, received scholarship money from Yale, and supplemented his income with winnings from playing poker. At the same time, he worked so hard that he was the top student in his class by the end of his 3rd year. It was at Yale that he decided he would make his living as an investor. He loved arithmetic and solving problems methodically. It also seemed like a profession in which he could serve others, helping them to attain the financial security that his own family lacked. The accepted strategy in those days was for Americans to invest exclusively in U.S. assets. But he saw even then that this narrow-mindedness was contrary to common sense. If a person were going to own stocks and bonds, it would be much wiser to search everywhere, rather than limiting themselves to one nation. After Yale, Templeton spent 2 years at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. He wanted to study business management, but his professors didn't regard it as a legitimate subject. They looked at me in a funny way as if I'd told them I wanted to study garbage. He studied law instead. In his spare time, he read about business. At the time, he could find only one book about investing. In the depths of the Depression, the stock market was a toxic wasteland. From October 1929 to July 1932, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged 89%. In the wake of that catastrophe, few people had the financial or emotional fortitude to pick through the rubble in search of bargains. But the fact that others were too scared to invest did nothing to diminish Templeton's interest. Against this backdrop of widespread gloom, he asked himself a critical question: how can I buy a stock for a fraction of what it's worth? His answer: absolutely nothing will make a stock go down to an extremely low price except for other people urgently trying to sell. Templeton had witnessed firsthand how financial distress had forced farmers in Tennessee to sell their land for next to nothing. The lesson was etched in his brain: you have to buy at a time when other people are desperately trying to sell. He later coined a marvelous phrase to describe these moments when fear and desperation go viral: the point of maximum pessimism. In the meantime, Templeton grabbed every opportunity to travel, eager to learn more about foreign markets where he might eventually invest. After graduating from Oxford, he spent 7 months visiting 27 countries, carrying a sleeping bag, 1 change of clothing, 4 guidebooks, and a Bible. He stayed in Berlin during the 1936 Olympics, which the Nazis used as a propaganda showcase, traveled to Eastern Europe, visited Egypt and Palestine, and even made it to India, Japan, and China. At a time when few Americans ventured overseas, he was already building an informational edge over investors who lacked his insatiable thirst for knowledge. Returning to America in 1937, Templeton married, spent 3 months at a Wall Street brokerage firm called Fenner and Bean, then quit to work for an oil exploration company. By 1939, he'd saved about $30,000. The investment environment could hardly have seemed less inviting even for a seasoned stock picker, let alone a novice. The United States was trapped in a vortex of depression, deflation, and mass unemployment. The Dow, which had peaked at 381 in 1929, still languished below 150 in 1939. Worst of all, the world was poised for war. In short, it was the perfect time for a 20-something Southerner with almost no experience in the markets to demonstrate that he was the smartest, most cool-headed investor of his generation. The bet of a century. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Over the next few months, Norway, Holland, and Belgium surrendered to the Nazis. In May 1940, when Germany invaded France, the Dow sank to a new low of 112. The UK stock market crashed about 40% in less than 4 months amid fears of an imminent German invasion of the British Isles. Winston Churchill would later describe 1940 as the most splendid, most deadly year in our long English and British story. When the world is teetering over the edge of the abyss, how should a savvy investor respond? Conventional opinion might suggest that this was a prudent time to beat a retreat. With stocks crashing to new lows and panic rampant, surely the appropriate response was to seek safety in more defensive assets such as cash, gold, or land. But Templeton was not conventional. After Germany's invasion of Poland, he realized that the world was plunging inexorably into war, and that the United States would ultimately have to fight, too. But his icily logical response set him apart. Templeton told me, "I thought if there's any time when every product is in demand, it's during a war." So I said, if this is going to develop into a world war, which companies will prosper? Yeah. He concluded that maybe 90% of American businesses would have more demand and less competition during a war. Even the weakest companies were likely to recover as wartime spending surged, reinvigorating the economy and boosting employment. Savaged by the Great Depression, many companies were so close to death that a sudden change in their fortunes would have an outsized impact on their stock price. Reborn, they might well outperform the stocks of healthier companies that weren't so beaten down. You might call it survival of the unfittest. But how best to take advantage of this shrewd insight? Templeton opened the Wall Street Journal and identified 104 American companies that had experienced such a terrible depression that their stocks traded at $1 or less. A couple of days later, he called a stockbroker who'd been his boss at Fenner and Bean and asked to invest $100 in each of those companies. He called me back and said, That's a very unusual order, but we're going ahead with it, except we've eliminated 37 companies that are already in bankruptcy. And I said, oh no. Don't eliminate those. They may recover. Yeah. It was an astonishingly bold bet. But Templeton was so sure of his judgment that he even convinced his ex-boss to lend him $10,000 to fund the investment. The future had never looked so bleak. Yet so much dire news was already priced into the market that Templeton thought the odds were stacked resoundingly in his favor. He recalled, it was common sense arithmetic that attracted me. One company that exemplified this arithmetic was Missouri Pacific Railroad, which had been among the world's largest railroads before going bankrupt in the Depression. In its halcyon days, the company had issued preferred stock that was supposed to pay an annual dividend of $7 per share in perpetuity. But shareholders didn't receive their dividends after the firm went bust, and the price of the preferred stock collapsed from $100 to around 12 cents per share. Psychologically, it's tough to love a money-losing company that has burned all of its investors. But Templeton said he bought 800 shares of Missouri Pacific for $100. Like Buffett and Munger, he had an unemotional appreciation for a mispriced bet that offered an asymmetry between risk and reward. The potential on the upside was much greater than on the downside, Templeton explained to me. Sure, I may lose my $100. But if I don't lose my $100, I might make a lot. He was right. Railroads prospered during the war, and the stock rebounded from 12 cents to $5 before he cashed out. His only regret was that he sold too soon. I was so excited about having any stock I bought go up 40 times that I thought that was enough, he recalled. It was foolishness. Within 4 years thereafter, it went up to $105. Of course, a bet like this relied on so much more than mere mathematics. Mark Mobius, an eminent investor in emerging markets who worked with Templeton for years, once told me that it required tremendous willpower and strength of personality for Templeton to buy at the point of maximum pessimism. As Mobius put it, everybody else is running out of the burning building. What's remarkable to me is not just that Templeton had the courage to invest in 104 reviled stocks as the world went to war. It's that he had the courage to hold them for years, even as the drumbeat of disastrous news grew more and more deafening. In December 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, spurring the United States to join the war. By 1942, Germany had seized control of most of Europe. Despair about the future ran so deep that the markets took a terrible pounding. In April 1942, the Dow slumped to a generational low of 92. In his superb book Wealth, War and Wisdom, Barton Biggs points out that the State of New York Insurance Commission actually banned stocks from the portfolios of insurance companies in 1942, deeming them an inappropriate investment. At the time, writes Biggs, every right-thinking prognosticator with a head on his shoulders was bearish. Yet Templeton stood firm. I had enough self-confidence to think that most of the people called experts were making big mistakes, he told me. He was also sustained by his religious faith, which enabled him to trust that the world would eventually emerge from chaos. Even in the worst of times, he said, I never was depressed or despairing. The heavens smiled kindly upon him. In the spring of 1942, the market stopped falling and took flight as the Allies, fortunes improved, and the U.S. economy revived. Templeton stocks, once spurned, now soared. After 5 tempestuous years, he finally sold. When I liquidated those holdings, I had a profit on 100 out of 104, he said. I made roughly 5 times my money. I've come to regard Templeton's wartime bet as one of the boldest and most prescient investments in history, a triumph of both intellect and character. Despite his inexperience, he understood enough about economic history, financial markets, and human nature to recognize that overwhelming pessimism would eventually give way to unbridled optimism. Even in the darkest of times, he never forgot that the sun also rises. 6 Guiding Principles for the Non-Tribal Investor. After we chatted in his office for a couple of hours, Templeton drove me to his home. It was a stately building, with white columns designed in the style of an antebellum house in the South. With a view of the ocean and a golf course, it felt quiet and peaceful. He often said that his investment performance improved after moving here, because the location strengthened his psychological detachment from the Wall Street herd. In his early years here, the Wall Street Journal often arrived days late. For a long-term investor, this could be an unexpected advantage. The house was furnished with old-fashioned charm. The living room had a wooden rocking chair, silver candlesticks, and leather-bound books such as The Life of Christ and the poetry of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Upstairs in his study, Templeton pointed out a painting that depicted him at Buckingham Palace on the day in 1987, when Queen Elizabeth II knighted him for his services to philanthropy. I asked how it felt to receive so many accolades. "It's like winning a game," he replied. "I must admit that I'm human. This year I received my 22nd honorary doctorate, and that did give me some feeling that maybe I was not too foolish." We sat down in his living room. Templeton sipped tea out of a mug emblazoned with the FBI's motto, "Fidelity, Bravery, Integrity." He then shared with me what he saw as the most important lessons of his investment career. During this conversation and a follow-up phone interview, he mentioned 6 guiding principles that he believed would help any investor. This wisdom was the fruit of more than 60 years of practical experience and contemplation by one of the greatest minds of the investment world. It's worth noting that none of these principles was cloned. When I asked Templeton if anyone had influenced him either as an investor or in other areas of life, he replied, "Absolutely no one. I didn't find anyone that I wanted to rely on." What about his parents? "Not that either." "First of all," said Templeton, "beware of emotion. Most people get led astray by emotions in investing. They get led astray by being excessively careless and optimistic when they have big profits, and by getting excessively pessimistic and too cautious when they have big losses." One of the primary services he provided as a money manager was to help his clients get away from that emotionalism. It was a major element in my success. But he didn't just avoid the pitfalls of emotion. He exploited the wayward emotions of other investors, buying from them when they were irrationally bearish and selling to them when they were irrationally bullish. To buy when others are despondently selling, and to sell when others are enthusiastically buying is the most difficult, he said. But it pays the greatest rewards. It came naturally for Templeton to approach every decision analytically, whether it was choosing a profession, picking a stock, or deciding where to live. Before moving to Lyford Key, he took several sheets of paper, wrote a different place name at the top of each sheet, then listed every advantage of that place. Describing this process, he said emphatically, it was not emotional. "Second," said Templeton, "beware of your own ignorance, which is probably an even bigger problem than emotion. So many people buy something with the tiniest amount of information. They don't really understand what it is that they're buying." It pays to remember the simple fact that there are 2 sides in every investment transaction. The one with the greatest information is likely to come out ahead. It takes a huge amount of work and study and investigation. Templeton claimed that diligence had played a much greater role in his success than innate talent. He often spoke of his determination to give the extra ounce, To make the extra call, to schedule the extra meeting, to take the extra research trip. He was similarly dedicated to his lifelong program of continuous self-education. As a young man, he said, I searched for anything available in writing on the subject of investing, and I still do. Even in his 80s, he said, I try to be more knowledgeable each year as an investor. Templeton argued that amateurs and professionals alike must avoid fooling themselves into believing that it's easy to build a strong investment record. Even with the professionals, not many of them turn out to produce superior results. So the way to invest is to say to yourself, do I have more experience and wisdom than the professionals? And if you don't, then don't do it. Hire a professional. Don't be so egotistical that you think you'll do better than the experts. Third, said Templeton, you should diversify broadly to protect yourself from your own fallibility. By his calculation, he had made at least 500,000 investment decisions in his career. For many years, he kept a detailed record of the advice he'd given to clients on which stocks to buy or sell. This revealed an uncomfortable truth. About a third of his advice was the opposite of wisdom. Investing is so difficult, he concluded, that even the best investors should assume that they'll be right no more than 2/3 of the time, however hard they work. The moral: get your ego and your risk exposure under control. Don't put all your money with any one expert. Don't put all your money in any one industry or any one nation. Nobody is that smart. So the wise thing is to diversify. Templeton recommended that the average investor should own a minimum of 5 mutual funds, each focused on a different area of the financial markets. It's helpful to study a fund manager's long-term record, he added, but this is hardly a guarantee of continued success. Again, we need to be honest about the limits of our knowledge. Don't be so egotistical that you think you know who is the right expert. Fourth, said Templeton, successful investing requires patience. When he bought U.S. stocks at the outbreak of World War II, he knew how cheap they were, but he couldn't predict how long it would take for the market to agree with him. His edge lay not just in his superior insight, but in his willingness to wait year after painful year for the situation to play out as he'd predicted. Templeton's affection for math reinforced his conviction that patience pays. To illustrate this, he mentioned the tale of Dutch immigrants buying Manhattan for $24 in 1626 III. If the Native American sellers had invested this derisory sum at 8% a year, he said, they would have enormously more than the total value of Manhattan today, including all the buildings. Templeton regarded this as an extreme example of a fundamental financial principle. In order to have a really good investment result, all you need is patience. He warned that almost all investors are too impatient, adding, people who change from one fund to another as often as once a year are basing it more on emotion than investigation. Fifth, said Templeton, the best way to find bargains is to study whichever assets have performed most dismally in the past 5 years, then to assess whether the cause of those woes is temporary or permanent. Most people are naturally drawn to investments that are already successful and popular with the herd, whether it's a high-flying stock or fund or a rapidly growing country. But if a sunny future is already reflected in the price of the asset, then it's probably a bet for suckers. Templeton, the least tribal of investors, took the opposite approach. He wanted to know, where is the outlook worst? These pockets of gloom were likely to yield the most enticing bargains, since asset prices would reflect the tribe's pessimism. His contrarian strategy involved scrutinizing stocks in beleaguered industries and markets around the world, constantly asking himself, which one is the lowest priced compared to what I believe it's worth? At the time of our discussions, the Asian financial crisis of 1997 had left a trail of destruction in countries such as Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea. If you wanted to identify the most battered investment vehicle on Earth, one clear contender was the Matthews Korea Fund, which lost about 65% in 1997. The fund had the misfortune of investing solely in a nation traumatized by a lending freeze, a collapsing currency, and deadly levels of corporate leverage. Templeton decided in late 1997 that South Korean stocks were the cheapest in the world relative to future corporate earnings. The price-earnings ratio of Korean stocks had crashed from more than 20 in June 1997 to 10 in December, a rough but revealing measure of investors' fear and loathing. Still, it was reasonable to assume that the country's history of powerful economic growth would eventually resume once this vicious liquidity crisis had passed. So Templeton poured $10 million into the Matthews Korea Fund, becoming its single largest shareholder. He told me it could hardly get any worse from a psychological and public relations standpoint. To the typical investor, that might not sound like a rousing endorsement. But just think for a moment about the simple elegance of his logic and the independence of mind required to wade into the South Korean market while everyone else flooded out. Sure enough, the crisis proved to be fleeting, just as he'd surmised. In June 1999, Bloomberg News reported that the Matthews Korea Fund had risen 266% in the past year, making it the single best performer in its ranking of 5,307 stock funds. As the Bible says, the last shall be first and the first last. 6, said Templeton, one of the most important things as an investor is not to chase fads. In the 1980s, the Templeton Foundation Press republished a timeless book with a magnificent title, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Written in 1841 by Charles Mackay, it tells the history of crazes such as tulip mania and the South Sea Bubble. Templeton wrote a foreword that offered a rational antidote to financial insanity. The best way for an investor to avoid popular delusions is to focus not on outlook but on value. He suggested that we ground ourselves in reality by investigating an array of specific valuation measures, including a company's market price in relation to its sales volume per share, its net asset value per share, and its average earnings per share for the last 5 years. This critical analysis of an investment's fundamental value acts as a safeguard against crowd madness. At the time of our meeting, U.S. stocks had enjoyed an 8-year bull run, and euphoric investors were betting blindly on technology and internet stocks. It seemed clear to me that we were in the midst of a mania, but I wanted Templeton to confirm what I suspected. He didn't make it easy. Early in our conversation, he had told me, the point of maximum optimism is the time to take your profits. But when I asked him repeatedly if we'd reached that point, he evaded the question. Finally, he snapped, "Anybody is stupid to ask that question." Is that clear? Nobody ever knows when the point comes. Some experts are right a little more often than you might be. But still, it's a human failing to even put your mind on a question of which stock market is going to go up or down. There's never been anybody who knew that. I felt like I'd been smacked around the head. I understood his broader point that making market predictions is a mug's game. But he knew as well as anyone that many U.S. stocks were poised for pain because their valuations were unsustainable. It was impossible to predict when the music would stop, but the outcome was pretty predictable. In retrospect, I suspect he was mad at me for not taking sufficient interest in his philanthropic work, which he insisted was the real story. Note to self: think twice before asking a revered icon if many people think he's a kook. In any case, it later emerged that Templeton hatched an inspired scheme to profit when the dot-com bubble burst. Hear how it worked. Back then, unscrupulous investment banks were making a killing by taking internet companies public. The Wall Street sales machine moved into overdrive, hyping and hawking any half-credible rubbish that naive, greedy, or reckless investors might be willing to buy. It was a classic outbreak of investment insanity, loads of fun until someone loses an eye. Templeton knew that this tragicomedy would end in tears. After all, he had often cautioned that the four most expensive words in the English language are "this time is different." His response was to target 84 of the most egregiously overvalued internet stocks, all of which had tripled since their initial public offering. After the IPO, a lockup period followed in which company employees weren't allowed to sell their shares, typically for 6 months. Templeton reasoned that these insiders would race to dump their stock at the first opportunity, since they'd be anxious to cash out before the euphoria faded. This stampede of insider selling would cause the stocks to crash. So Templeton sold short each of those 84 stocks, betting that they'd nosedive as soon as the lockup period expired. Lauren Templeton, a money manager who is his great-niece, has said that he placed a $2.2 million bet against each stock, a total of about $185 million. Templeton's short-selling strategy worked like a dream. When the dot-com bubble burst in March 2000, he earned a profit of more than $90 million in months. Years later, when The Economist ran an article about the greatest financial trades of all time, it declared that his ingenious scheme wins the "wish I'd thought of that" prize by a mile. It fills me with wonder that a man in his late 80s conjured up this glorious gambit. Best of all, there was an exquisite symmetry at play here. In 1939, he realized that the investment crowd had fallen for the illusion that the future offered nothing but misery and loss. In 1999, he realized that the investment crowd had fallen for the illusion that the future offered nothing but pleasure and profit. On both occasions, he trusted his superior judgment. In 1939, he bought a basket of stocks that the crowd hated. In 1999, he shorted a basket of stocks that the crowd adored. Two masterful investments, the mirror image of each other, separated by 6 decades. Master of his domain. Before we go any further, let me make a confession. The truth is, I didn't really like Sir John Templeton. Sure, I was excited to meet him, and I was grateful for his time. But I saw in him a cold austerity that I found unnerving. In his book Wisdom from World Religions, Pathways Toward Heaven on Earth, he wrote at length about virtues such as unlimited love, forgiveness, humility, and compassion. But the warm and generous side of his nature coexisted with a side that could seem stern and severe. He was kind enough to drive me to the airport so that I could continue interviewing him in his car. But after he left, I wrote a note to myself that captured my ambivalence about him. He's curiously dry, steely, formal. Charming but tough. Incredibly strong-willed. He claims to be open and listening, but he's dogmatic and extreme. In The Templeton Touch, a biography by William Proctor, one of the most perceptive reminiscences comes from Rory Knight, the former dean of Templeton College, Oxford, which Templeton helped to fund. He was a hard guy, Knight recalls. He was not a soft man walking around as a seminarian, just being nice to people. Now he was never rude to people, and he was an absolute gentleman. I would say, though, that he was demanding of people at all times in the best sense of that word. He brought out the best in people and set a hard expectation. To his credit, Templeton was especially demanding of himself. Take his attitude toward saving and spending. After my education, I had absolutely no money, and neither did my bride, he told me. So we deliberately saved 50 cents out of every dollar we earned. But he had no intention of relaxing his financial discipline, even when he was astronomically rich. While many of his peers favored private jets, he always insisted on flying coach. "I've got a lot better ways to spend my money than to waste it by getting a bigger seat," he explained. I never thought it was wise to waste anything. When Templeton was a famous fund manager, his employees would chuckle about his habit of writing on scraps of used paper, which he stapled together to create makeshift notepads. Late in life, he relished saving money by driving an inexpensive Kia car from South Korea. Gary Moore, a friend of his who served as an advisor to religious investors, joked to me, "John is what we call a Calvinist. He believes it's okay to make money so long as you don't enjoy it." Given his compulsive cheapness, it's no surprise that Templeton specialized in buying undervalued stocks. Distrustful of debt, he always paid cash for his cars and homes. He also claimed that his wartime bet was the only time he ever borrowed money to invest. During the Great Depression, he'd seen how easy it was for overextended people to come undone, and he regarded fiscal discipline as a moral virtue. As we were leaving his office, a stranger accosted him in the parking lot and asked for money to pay an electricity bill. Templeton handed him $50 in return for a promise that the man would never again ask him for money. In the car, he explained why this was his standard operating procedure. The type of person who runs out of money will keep on running out of money. And if he got it somewhere, he'll keep on going back there. Templeton's watchfulness over money also stemmed from his belief that we are merely temporary stewards of God's wealth. He liked to begin meetings at his fund company with a prayer, and he saw a strong connection between spirituality and material success. "If you focus on spiritual matters, you will very likely become wealthy," he told me. I never found a family that tithed 10% of their income to charity for 10 years that didn't become both prosperous and happy. So tithing is the single best investment in the world. He had even developed a new form of super tithing. For every dollar I spend on myself, I carefully give away $10. He was equally exacting in his approach to time management. John Galbraith, who marketed Templeton's funds, recalled, "John won't engage in small talk. The minute you're through with your common business, he's on to something else." Gary Moore added, "The first time I met John, he said, 'Be here at 4:02. I've got another appointment at 4:13. Determined not to squander a minute, Templeton made a habit of doing two things at once. During our meeting in his house, he underlined key passages in a book for me while simultaneously answering my questions. He also liked to multitask by praying as he drove. Obsessed with punctuality, he routinely arrived 10 minutes early for meetings. He abhorred procrastination. He disapproved of distractions such as television and movies, especially unprincipled entertainment, preferring to read corporate filings or inspirational books. He referred to goofing off as a form of theft and to idleness as a form of slow suicide. When I remarked that he seemed hard on himself, he replied, "Let's call it self-control." I do think that I've always worked on having more self-control, and I sure wish other people would. It wasn't just his money and his time that he managed with fierce self-discipline. He was also fixated on managing his mind. In Wisdom from World Religions, he returned over and over to the subject of thought control. In his daily life, he trained himself to focus on productive thoughts and positive emotions, such as love, thanksgiving, service, and the contemplation of the infinite good within ourselves and others. Templeton was equally committed to banishing negative thoughts and emotions such as anger, doubt, worry, guilt, fear, hatred, and envy. One technique that he recommended was to replace any negative thought with the statement, "I give thanks for the abundance of good in my life." When faced with difficulties, he suggested uttering a phrase such as, "This comes to bless me." He also sought to eradicate any aimless, undisciplined thinking that failed to serve the high aims of his life. As Templeton put it, we have immense power to shape our lives by choosing where we wish to place our focus, for what we focus on expands. IV. Templeton's determination to rule his mind helped him to endure some terrible times. In 1951, he and his first wife, Judith, were on vacation in Bermuda when she died in a motorcycle accident. As a 38-year-old widower, he suddenly found himself responsible for raising their 3 children alone. He made it through those years by crowding out the wrenching thoughts that might otherwise have overwhelmed his mind. In 1958, he married his second wife, Irene, a Christian Scientist who shared his belief in the power of the mind and prayer. As a skeptical journalist, my tendency in those days, not now, was to roll my eyes at the mention of positive thinking and thought control. I was so closed-minded that I also gave no serious consideration to Templeton's mission of exploring scientifically whether spiritual practices such as prayer or forgiveness might be beneficial. I'm embarrassed to admit it, but my prejudices made me smug and dismissive. Instead, I should have suspended judgment until I learned more. What I realize now is that Templeton's habits of positive thinking and prayer must have helped enormously in his battle to gain control over his thoughts and emotions. For an investor who specialized in taking unpopular positions, that mental strength was a powerful advantage. By contrast, my own mind was hopelessly undirected, and it was easy for me to get swamped by feelings such as fear, doubt, regret, greed, impatience, jealousy, and pessimism, all of which complicate the challenge of making rational investment decisions. In Wisdom from World Religions, Templeton wrote, "To live successfully in the outer world, it is important to live successfully in the inner world." The friends, associates, opportunities, careers, and life experiences of our outer world are reflections of what is happening within us. Templeton took control of his inner world. At the time, he struck me as judgmental and holier-than-thou, which made me less open to learning from him. But 20 years later, I find myself awed by his inner strength and iron will, and I wish that I had half of his self-control. As I see it now, Templeton didn't just master the markets. He mastered himself. He took responsibility for every aspect of his life, including his time, money, health, thoughts, and emotions. This required extraordinary self-discipline. We don't often celebrate self-discipline. It's such an old-fashioned and fusty virtue. But Templeton triumphed by taking self-discipline to an extreme. As Pabrai learned from Munger, take a simple idea and take it seriously. There's so much in investing in life that we cannot control. Templeton couldn't be sure that the Allies would prevail in World War II. He could never have predicted that his first wife would die young. But he controlled what he could control. As an investor, that meant focusing with remorseless discipline on valuations, on gathering better information than his rivals possessed, on making fearlessly independent judgments with no concern for the tastes of the tribe. It also meant doing everything in his power to maintain his mental and emotional equilibrium. He couldn't control the outcome, but he could control himself. What I failed to learn from Templeton 2 decades ago is the supreme importance of this inner game. Chapter 3: Everything Changes. How can we make smart decisions when nothing stays the same and the future is unknowable? Ask Howard Marks. That everything changes is the basic truth for each existence. No one can deny this truth, and all the teaching of Buddhism is condensed within it. Shunryu Suzuki, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. When Howard Marks was an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania, he signed up for a class in studio art. It was an eccentric choice for a student majoring in finance, but Marx was a talented artist in his youth. So I went to the art course, and the teacher walks in and looks around and says, "This is too many people. We have to weed out. I'm going to ask your name and your major." And so I said, "I'm Howard Marks, Wharton School of Finance." And he says, "Okay, you're the first to go. Get out." Yeah. Evicted from Eden, Marx was forced to find another subject for his minor. To his surprise, he fell in love with Japanese literature, art, and civilization. It was in a class on Japanese Buddhism that he encountered the Zen concept of mujo, or impermanence. Sitting in his corner office on the 34th floor of a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, Marx explains how this ancient idea has shaped his philosophy of investing and life. Change is inevitable. The only constant is impermanence, he says. We have to accommodate to the fact that the environment changes. We cannot expect to control our environment. We have to accommodate to our environment. We have to expect and go with change. Marx acknowledges that everything is in a state of constant flux: nature, economies, markets, industries, companies, and our own lives. This is decidedly awkward for investors, since we're engaged in betting very real money on circumstances that won't last and on a future that's unknowable. How can we make wise decisions in the face of such acute instability and uncertainty? As the famed investor Bill Miller once told me, the world changes. This is the biggest problem in markets. Indeed, it's a problem that pervades our lives. The French philosopher Michel de Montaigne wrote, "We, and our judgment, and all mortal things go on flowing and rolling unceasingly. Thus nothing certain can be established about one thing by another, both the judging and the judged being in continual change." A prominent French investor, François-Marie Wadsick, was jubilant when I read him these lines, which Montaigne penned in the 1570s. Wary of overestimating his own or anybody else's judgment in a constantly changing world where nothing certain can be established, Wadsick remarks, "I have three principles: doubt, doubt, and doubt." The problem of transience, which lies at the heart of Buddhist teaching, has long preoccupied the most thoughtful investors. T. Rowe Price, founder of the Baltimore-based investment firm that bears his name, wrote an essay in 1937 titled "Change, the Investor's Only Certainty." Struggling to assess the geopolitical perils of his time, Price mentioned Hitler's rise to power, then ventured a prediction that Germany will acquire territory, preferably through peaceful means. 2 years later, Hitler invaded Poland, plunging the world into 6 years of war. Everything changed, but not in ways that Price or anyone else could predict with any precision. Marx was born in 1946, a few months after the war ended, and grew up in Queens, New York, at a time when the pace of change seemed to him relatively slow and benign. "Comic books cost a dime for my entire youth," he recalls. "We all thought that the world was a stable place, and that events played out against an unchanging backdrop. Now it's clear that the world is changing all the time, unpredictably, at incredible speed. Nothing is the same anymore, and for people whose approach to life is based on sameness, that must be very upsetting. In the world of business, sameness and stability are not an option. Companies rise and fall, locked in a Darwinian struggle for supremacy and survival, and industry after industry is disrupted by technological innovation. Time Inc., where I spent much of my career as a journalist, recently ceased to exist after decades as the world's dominant magazine publisher. When I joined in the 1990s, the firm was known as the Velvet Coffin, a resting place so rich and plush that we might never get out alive. In 2018, Time Inc. became a feeble unit within the Meredith Corporation, which made its hay with magazines such as Successful Farming and Fruit, garden, and home. Meredith broke up the company like a junkyard car and sold the parts for scrap. As investors, we long for definitive answers to complex questions about the future. Will the stock market rise or fall? Will the economy thrive or flounder? Marx points out that investing consists entirely of divining the future. In analyzing any asset, we must figure out what price to pay today, given our expectations of future profits and valuations. Likewise, in other areas of life, we have to deal with the future. We have to make decisions on where to live, what job to take, who to marry, and how many kids to have. But if everything is changing faster than ever and tomorrow may look nothing like today, how can we position ourselves adroitly for what lies ahead? Most people make their investment decisions and life decisions on the basis of an unreliable hodgepodge of half-baked logic, biases, hunches, emotion, and vague fantasies or fears about the future. I've moved countries several times without truly thinking it through, largely driven by whims or frustration. By contrast, Marx is a master of disciplined and dispassionate thinking, a skill that has made him one of the undisputed giants of the investment world. As co-chairman of Oaktree Capital Management, he oversees about $120 billion in assets. A pioneer in the field of alternative investing, Oaktree specializes in areas such as distressed debt, junk bonds, convertible securities, commercial real estate, and control investments in businesses with untapped potential. The firm's clients include about 70 of the largest U.S. pension funds, hundreds of endowments and foundations, and many of the world's biggest sovereign wealth funds. Oaktree's stellar returns and reputation have made Marx rich. Forbes estimates his net worth at $2.2 billion. He used to own a $75 million estate in Malibu, and he later bought a $52.5 million pad in Manhattan. But ideas, not money, are his drug of choice. Above all, Marx is an original thinker, a man captivated by subjects such as risk, randomness, cyclicality, the psychology of investing, and the threat of what he calls improbable disasters. Marx oversees Oaktree's investment strategy, but he structured his job so that none of the firm's 950 or so employees report to him. He has also handed off all day-to-day responsibilities for selecting individual investments, leaving himself free to read, think, and write. His memos, which he has penned for more than a quarter of a century, provide a priceless trove of financial wisdom. Warren Buffett once wrote, "When I see memos from Howard Marks in my mail, they are the first thing I open and read. I always learn something." Marx turned his memos into an indispensable book, the most important thing, Uncommon Sense for the Thoughtful Investor. In person, he has the air of an unusually brilliant professor, peppering his speech with phrases such as "the rebuttable presumption has to be," and "in my myth of myself." During our conversations, he naturally assumes the role of a teacher, pausing to draw a graph or to read from his well-thumbed copies of esoteric books such as C. Jackson Grayson's Decisions Under Uncertainty, Drilling Decisions by Oil and Gas Operators. One of his greatest pleasures, says Marx, is sharing ideas and having people respond. "That was helpful. I never thought of that." To my mind, nobody in the investment world has thought more helpfully about what we can and cannot know, and how to prepare for the future instead of fooling ourselves into believing we can predict it. Faced with the challenge of making rational decisions, I'm sometimes tempted to throw up my hands in dismay. How can I possibly figure out a smart course of action, given the overwhelming complexity of the forces at play and how little control I have over the outcome? But Marx, whom I regard as a philosopher king of finance, provides a set of profound insights and practical strategies that can help us immeasurably to navigate through the fog. First, be lucky. Second, be humble. In a world where nothing is stable or dependable, and almost anything can happen, the first rule of the road is to be honest with ourselves about our limitations and vulnerabilities. As the Athenian playwright Euripides warned nearly 2,500 years ago, how can you think yourself a great man when the first accident that comes along can wipe you out completely? Montaigne, one of the wisest of men, had this sentence inscribed on a beam in the library of his chateau. Marx, who is keenly aware of the dangers of pride and arrogance, has decorated one wall of his office with a centuries-old painting of wooden sailing ships tossed around by terrifying waves. He bought it in 2001, at a time when foolhardy speculators had been dashed mercilessly against the rocks by the dot-com crash. The painting offers a disconcerting reminder that none of us is immune to the destructive power of forces that are bigger than us and beyond our control, a lesson we learned again in 2020 when, out of nowhere, a virus cast the whole world into chaos. Absolutely nobody had a pandemic on their radar screen, and then it turns out to be the defining event of our lives, says Marx. That in itself should convince us that we don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes we don't even know what could happen. In the 1987 novel The Bonfire of the Vanities, Tom Wolfe coined the phrase "masters of the universe" to describe the hotshot investment bankers pulling down millions of dollars a year in bonuses. But as Marx sees it, the screwiest thing you can do is to think you're a master of the universe. We're all just little cogs, and the universe will go on without us. We have to fit into it and adapt to it. When I ask him about a fellow billionaire who often makes bold predictions about the economy and the markets, Marx concedes that he's extremely smart, but adds, "At the end of the day, the world will see if he's as smart as he thought he was. Because if you think you're smarter than you are, you get into trouble." Sometimes I wish he didn't think he's as good as he is. One way that Marx keeps his own ego in check is by reminding himself of the starring role that luck has played in his life. After reading Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, which explores various causes of success, Marx compiled a list of lucky breaks that have helped to propel him to where he is today. His streak began with the demographic luck of being born to white, middle-class parents in the United States at the start of a golden era of post-war growth. Nobody in his family had a college degree, but he was fortunate that his parents valued learning, bought an encyclopedia, and encouraged him to go to college. His high school grades were nothing special, so he thinks he was also lucky that Wharton accepted him. And it was Wharton that exposed him to finance, leading him to jettison his earlier ambition of a career in accounting. His second choice, a large state university, would certainly have lacked Wharton's cachet among Wall Street recruiters. I once gave an interview in which I mentioned that Marx has a high IQ, which has no doubt contributed significantly to his success. In response, he sent me a charmingly modest email, remarking, "People who don't fully acknowledge their luck miss the fact that being intelligent is nothing but luck. No one does anything to deserve a high IQ." After Wharton, Marx applied to the MBA program at Harvard, but like Buffett was rejected. Bad luck? Hardly. Instead, he ended up at the University of Chicago's Business School in 1967, when it was leading a revolution in financial theory. The Chicago School of Academics had recently developed the efficient market hypothesis, which contends that assets are correctly priced to reflect all of the relevant information available to investors. This theory gave rise to the belief that it's impossible to beat the market consistently, which suggests that investors should settle for owning low-cost index funds that mirror the market's returns. Indexing, as we'll later discuss, is undeniably a smart option, given how difficult it is to outperform the market after expenses. As Marx puts it, most people should index most of their money. When he heard his professor's explanations of market efficiency, Marx says he experienced the financial equivalent of Satori, the moment of enlightenment in Zen Buddhism. It made sense to him that millions of investors hustling to earn a profit would find the bargains and buy them up. This is not universally true, he says, but it makes a hell of a lot more sense than to think that something could be an obvious bargain and nobody else will tumble to it. Marx regards the efficient market hypothesis as a very powerful concept. Still, there's a big enough difference between academic theory and real-world practice for him to have earned billions for himself and his clients. There's an old joke he tells, which goes like this. A professor of finance and a student are strolling across the Chicago campus. The student stops and exclaims, "Look, there's a $5 bill on the ground." The professor replies, "It can't be a $5 bill or someone else would have picked it up already." The professor walks away, so the student picks up the money and buys himself a beer. Appropriately, Marx keeps in his wallet a folded $5 bill that he once found in the Harvard Business School library, a reminder of the limitations of theory. Marx drew a simple but life-changing lesson from these academic debates. If he wanted to add value as an investor, he should avoid the most efficient markets and focus exclusively on less efficient ones. The more a market is studied and followed and embraced and popularized, the less there should be bargains around for the asking, he says. For example, it's hard to find outlandish bargains among large U.S. companies, a mainstream market where swarms of intelligent, highly motivated money managers tend to drive out mispricings. If you want to invest in large-cap stocks, it makes sense to buy and hold an index fund that tracks the S&P 500, accepting that your odds of gaining a long-term edge in this efficient market are poor. Marx would gain an edge by fishing in less popular ponds, such as the debt of distressed companies, an area that most investors avoid because it seems scary and opaque. He compares investing in inefficient markets to playing poker only against weak and error-prone opponents. On graduating from Chicago, Marx applied for several jobs, including one at Lehman Brothers. The one thing I was sure of was that I wanted that Lehman job. To his dismay, the offer never came. So he took a position at First National City Bank, which later became Citibank. He spent the next decade there as a stock analyst, and then as the director of research. Many years later, he learned from a campus recruiter that Lehman had decided to hire him, but the partner in charge of phoning him had a hangover and failed to deliver the good news. Marx often wonders what would have become of him if he'd received that call and built his career at Lehman. In 2008, the firm went bankrupt, losing all of its partners' money and crashing the global economy. After 10 years in equity research, Marx was informed that Citibank was replacing him as head of the department, so he had to find a new role. He didn't want to waste his time in a well-covered niche such as healthcare stocks, where it would be hard to know more than other investors. So I said, I'll do anything except spend the rest of my life choosing between Merck and Eli Lilly. Nobody is going to get that right more than 50% of the time. In the end, his boss told him to run 2 new funds in a realm where he had no experience: convertible securities and high-yield bonds. This may have been the luckiest break of all. Unwittingly, he was now positioned to ride a multi-decade boom in new and exotic forms of credit, far beyond the dull, respectable domain of low-risk bonds with AAA ratings. We often assume that skill, not luck, is the most vital ingredient of success. Maybe, but it's hard to beat the good fortune of starting at the ideal time to catch a monster wave. Michael Price, a legendary stock picker, once told me how his career took flight when he was hired at age 24 by a veteran value investor named Max Hine, whose lone mutual fund then had assets of just $5 million. For $200 a week, I started on January 2nd or 3rd of 1975, which was the low point of the equity market for the century, except for the Great Depression, Price told me. No one in the U.S. wanted to buy stocks. So I was lucky enough to get with a terrific value investor who'd been in the business for 40 years at the low point of the modern bull market, when they were giving away stocks in America. So there was almost no way I could fail. Over the next 2 decades, assets in the company's mutual funds grew to around $18 billion. In 1996, Price sold the firm for more than $600 million. It also helps if, like Marx and Price, you stumble into an opportunity that happens to suit your talents and temperament. Debt fits my personality, says Marx, because you have a promise of repayment when the bond matures, plus a promise of annual interest payments. If the debt is repaid, you know in advance what your return will be because it's spelled out contractually. The key is to avoid getting saddled with bad loans, so the first question to ask is whether the borrower is creditworthy. The second question is whether the borrower's assets are sufficiently valuable, since the creditor will have a senior claim against those assets if the debt isn't repaid. I think these questions are answerable, says Marx. In an uncertain world where so many questions are unanswerable, bonds offer a comforting measure of predictability and control. Bonds are also less risky than stocks, which is reassuring for a natural-born worrier. What would have happened if his boss had given him a less appropriate assignment, such as running a venture capital fund? That would have been terrible for me, says Marx. In venture capital, you've got to be a dreamer and a futurist. Still, when he started out in high-yield bonds in 1978, it wasn't exactly a glamorous gig. Known colloquially as junk bonds, they were widely reviled as disreputable assets that posed an unacceptable risk of default. Marx says most investment organizations had a rule against buying them, and Moody's declared that the entire category of B-rated bonds fails to possess the characteristics of a desirable investment. Ironically, this dogmatic belief that junk bonds must be a bad investment was what made them alluring to Marx. When there's a really powerful bias against an asset class, that's a way to get a bargain. And that's what I did. What the naysayers failed to grasp is a fundamental truth that enabled Marx, like Sir John Templeton before him, to make a fortune. Any asset, however ugly, can be worth buying if the price is low enough. Indeed, Marx believes that buying cheap is the single most reliable route to investment riches, and that overpaying is the greatest risk. Thus, the essential question to ask about any potential investment should be, is it cheap? Paradoxically, the prejudice against junk bonds made these supposedly risky assets so cheap that they became relatively unrisky. For Marx, much of the fascination of investing lies in such subtleties. In one of multiple memos that he's written about risk, he muses, "I'm convinced that everything that's important in investing is counterintuitive, and everything that's obvious is wrong." Marx left Citibank in 1985 to work at a Los Angeles-based investment firm, TCW Group. One of his colleagues there, Bruce Karsh, came up with the idea for a distressed debt fund, which would invest in the bonds of companies that were either in bankruptcy or veering toward it. Once again, Marx was quick to recognize the strange beauty of a poorly understood market that others found repellent. If junk bonds are suspect, he says, what could be more disreputable than investing in the debt of companies that are bankrupt? He and Karsh forged an enduring partnership. In 1995, they quit TCW and co-founded Oaktree. It would grow into a colossus, built largely on an unseemly foundation of junk and distressed debt. Without luck, Marx would never have landed in these inefficient, bargain-rich markets. Without intellectual horsepower and independence of mind, he could never have exploited the opportunities he found there. Look, luck is not enough, he says. But equally, intelligence is not enough, hard work is not enough, and even perseverance is not necessarily enough. You need some combination of all four. We all know people who were intelligent and worked hard, but didn't get lucky. It breaks my heart. People come to me all the time looking for jobs. They're 50 years old, they lost their job, and they're no less deserving. By reminding himself repeatedly of his good fortune, Marx protects himself from what I would call master of the universe syndrome. His humility boosts his immunity against overconfidence, which is a persistent threat to the smartest or luckiest investors. But there's one other great benefit to acknowledging his luck. It makes him happy. I walk around with this incredible feeling that I'm a lucky guy, Marx confides. If you're a negative person, you might say, well, I've been lucky in my life, and that really sucks because it means that my success is undeserved and may not continue. But I say, gee, what a great thing to be lucky. And you know, I really owe it to somebody, whether it's God or chance or whatever. Yeah. Templeton seemed to have little doubt that his success was divinely ordained. But what about Marx? He's Jewish by birth, but was raised as a Christian Scientist and went to church every Sunday as a child. These days, he considers himself Jewish, but not religious. I'm a big believer in randomness, he says, and I just believe I've been lucky. Know what you don't know. Marx maintains a huge compendium of useful quotes that he's amassed over decades, and he cites them frequently in explaining his investment credo. One of his favorite insights is from the economist John Kenneth Galbraith, an intellectual hero of his, who said, "We have two classes of forecasters, those who don't know, and those who don't know they don't know." The investment world is filled with people who believe, or pretend, that they can see what the future holds. They include smooth-talking market strategists from Wall Street brokerage firms who confidently predict the precise percentage rise of the stock market in the coming year, instead of acknowledging that they have no idea whether the market will go up or down. Equity analysts who provide quarterly earnings estimates for the companies they cover, thereby feeding the illusion that profits are consistent and predictable, not lumpy and erratic. Managers of macro hedge funds who place aggressive wagers on swings in currencies, interest rates, and anything else that moves. TV pundits and financial journalists who claim with a straight face to know what the latest and mostly inexplicable market fluctuations portend for investors. But how much substance lies behind the bluster? Marx often quotes an observation by Amos Tversky, an Israeli psychologist who studied cognitive biases alongside Daniel Kahneman. It's frightening to think that you might not know something, but more frightening to think that, by and large, the world is run by people who have faith that they know exactly what's going on. It's worth pausing for a moment to let that unsettling idea lodge forever in your brain. Occasionally, the forecasters get it right, but Marx regards these successes as proof of the adage that even a blind squirrel sometimes finds an acorn. That said, he acknowledges a small number of legitimate exceptions, investors such as George Soros and Stanley Druckenmiller, who have repeatedly defied the odds by betting successfully on their macroeconomic predictions. There are all these ways that I think you can't be a good investor, such as forecasting the future and making huge bets on the basis of those forecasts, says Marx. But certain individuals have proved him wrong, because what you mustn't overlook is the human ingredient. Nonetheless, Marx himself is a staunch member of what he calls the "I don't know" school of thought. As he sees it, the future is influenced by an almost infinite number of factors, and so much randomness is involved that it's impossible to predict future events with any consistency. Recognizing that we can't forecast the future might sound like a disheartening admission of weakness. In reality, it's a tremendous advantage to acknowledge our limitations and operate within the boundaries of what's possible. Out of weakness comes strength. How does this awareness of his limitations liberate Marx from useless or harmful activities? For a start, he doesn't squander any time attempting to forecast interest rates, inflation, or the pace of economic growth. Following his example, neither should we. If Marx can't forecast such things, I'm fairly confident that I can't do it either. Unlike many of its rivals, Oaktree doesn't even have an in-house economist, and the firm doesn't invite outside experts to read the macroeconomic tea leaves. Marx also eschews the idea of timing the market, given the impossibility of repeatedly predicting the right moments to jump in and out. He noted in one of his earliest memos that the average annual return for stocks from 1926 to 1987 was 9.44%. But if you had gone to cash and missed the best 50 of those 744 months, you would have missed all of the return. This tells me that attempts at market timing are a source of risk, not protection. IV. Oaktree also tries to avoid what Marx describes as future-oriented investments, which rules out seductive assets such as tech stocks, purveyors of fashion items, and anything that reeks of faddishness. Early in his career, his department at Citibank was an exuberant cheerleader for one of the most infamous of fads, the Nifty 50, a group of high-octane growth stocks such as Xerox Corp., Avon Products, and Polaroid Corp., which reached head-spinning valuations before collapsing in 1973-74. That experience left him with a permanent distrust for fantasies of never-ending growth projected into a distant, joyous future. One of our conversations took place in 2017, during a heady period when Marx saw a similar outbreak of investment euphoria over the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Alphabet, formerly Google. People are acting like there's no limit to their success and no price is too high, he warned. Historically, that's been dangerous in most cases. Trees have never grown to the sky. They may someday. I'm not going to bet on it. If his habitual skepticism means missing out on an occasional exception to the laws of gravity, that's fine by him. Marx prefers to remain tethered to the ground by focusing on reasonable propositions, where the price of a specific security is low relative to its intrinsic value. It's easy to invest in dreams, he says. The challenge is to discern value in what's tangible today. Any investor who hopes to achieve enduring success should internalize this fundamental idea of buying assets below their value. As we've seen, this is a common thread that unites everyone from Buffett to Pabrai, Templeton to Marx. When analyzing any asset, what Marx wants to know above all is the amount of optimism that's in the price. With the FANGs, there's a lot of optimism. Too much. Who knows? Will one of them become the world's first perpetual motion machine, the first company that A. doesn't stumble and B. is not subject to disruption? I don't know. This combustible mixture of unknowability and rampant optimism is enough to scare him off, not because he knows precisely what will happen, but because the probability of disappointment is too high. In the months after our discussion, the FANGs continued to soar. But Marx is able to watch without regret when others hit the jackpot with what he regards as ill-advised bets. An incorrigible hoarder of wisdom, he has kept an old fortune cookie that says, "The cautious seldom err or write great poetry." He's comfortable with a prosaic approach that reduces the likelihood of catastrophic error. You have to do what's appropriate for your makeup. That's very important. When I ask about his most damaging investment mistakes, he replies, "I don't remember ever making a big mistake of commission, just omission." In retrospect, Marx concedes that not owning Amazon was a mistake of omission. But it was not a mistake to take a generally cautious approach, at a time when there was too much confidence, too little risk aversion, too much capital trying to find a home, and too much use of leverage. Those signs of excess led Oaktree to invest with heightened caution for several years. Finally, in March 2020, the 11-year bull market ended when mounting terror over COVID-19 led the S&P 500 to plunge by 33.9% in less than a month. Nobody could have predicted that a virus believed to have jumped from bats to humans in Wuhan would catalyze the quickest market meltdown in U.S. history. But if the market is precarious, you don't have to know what the catalyst will be, says Marx. You only have to know that there's a vulnerability. As the virus spread, the mood among investors flipped from, "I can't imagine what can go wrong," to, "I can't imagine what can go right." Their pessimism wasn't unfounded. As Marx told me in 2020, this is a time when people are afraid of dying, they're afraid of going out of their houses, and they're afraid of a depression. But their readiness to sell assets at very low prices with urgency provided him with a long-awaited opportunity. Amid the panic, Oaktree invested a couple of $1 billion, snapping up high-yield bonds that offered a vast reward. The future had seldom seemed more unknowable or less inviting. Yet the investment risks had actually diminished. As Marx saw it, the odds switched from precarious to propitious, for the simple reason that things got cheap enough. The market then confounded expectations once more by staging the fastest rebound since the 1930s. So Marx recalibrated again, returning to a defensive posture as surging optimism caused the supply of bargains to dry up. His detached and unemotional behavior reflected perfectly the fundamental investment lesson he had drawn from Buddhism. Remember, we have to accommodate to the fact that the environment changes. Find order within chaos. When I was in high school, I took an English literature exam that posed an unusually profound question. The novelist Henry James wrote that life is all inclusion and confusion, while art is all discrimination and selection. Discuss. As a writer, I love this idea that the artist's mission is to find order within the all-inclusive confusion and muddle of life. James likened this search for hidden structure to a suspicious dog's efforts to sniff out some buried bone. The investor faces a similar challenge. Life is endlessly confusing and complicated. But what if we could detect some underlying patterns within that infinitely complex web? Then we might have more success in figuring out what the future has in store for us. Marx has a rare gift for identifying cyclical patterns that have occurred again and again in financial markets. Once we understand these patterns, we can avoid being blindsided by them and can even profit from them. It's very helpful, Marx tells me, to view the world as behaving cyclically and oscillating rather than going in some straight line. He believes that almost everything is cyclical. For example, the economy expands and contracts, consumer spending waxes and wanes, corporate profitability rises and falls, the availability of credit eases and tightens, asset valuations soar and sink. Instead of continuing unabated in one direction, all of these phenomena eventually reverse course. He compares these patterns to the swinging of a pendulum from one extreme to the other. The financial markets are the perfect laboratory for the study of cyclicality because they're driven by investor psychology, which veers perennially between euphoria and despondency, greed and fear, credulousness and skepticism, complacency and terror. Humans get carried away, so the trend always overshoots in one direction or the other. But Marx operates on the assumption that the cycle will eventually self-correct, and the pendulum will swing back in the opposite direction. The future may be unpredictable, But this recurring process of boom and bust is remarkably predictable. Once we recognize this underlying pattern, we're no longer flying blind. The problem is, most investors act as if the latest market trend will continue indefinitely. Behavioral economists use the term recency bias to describe the cognitive glitch that leads us to overweight the importance of our recent experiences. Marx notes that the human mind also has a treacherous tendency to suppress painful memories. If this weren't the case, I'm guessing that my wife wouldn't have been willing to endure more than one pregnancy, and I'm not sure how many writers could muster the strength to keep returning to the blank screen. In our financial lives, this life-enhancing ability to forget unpleasant experiences is less helpful because the woes and mishaps of the past tend to provide the most valuable lessons. One way to combat this costly tendency to forget is through intensive study of market history. You can't know the future, says Marx, but it helps to know the past. He pulls from a bookshelf his inscribed copy of Galbraith's book, A Short History of Financial Euphoria, and reads me his single favorite piece of financial writing, which explores the causes of market euphoria. The first cause is the extreme brevity of the financial memory. In consequence, financial disaster is quickly forgotten. In further consequence, when the same or closely similar circumstances arise again, sometimes in only a few years, they are hailed by a new, often youthful, and always supremely self-confident generation as a brilliantly innovative discovery in the financial and larger economic world. There can be few fields of human endeavor in which history counts for so little as in the world of finance. Past experience, to the extent that it is part of memory at all, is dismissed as the primitive refuge of those who do not have the insight to appreciate the incredible wonders of the present. Watching the meteoric rise in the price of Bitcoin in 2017, Marx wondered if this was just the latest in a long history of incredible wonders that would prove less than wondrous. Likewise, he could never bring himself to bet that thrilling stocks such as Tesla and Netflix would continue to soar to infinity and beyond. When things or people are successful, it usually brings in hubris, overexpansion, a belief that we can't miss, which is very dangerous. He always assumes that the pendulum will eventually swing in the opposite direction, just as it did for the superstocks that dominated previous bull markets. It's easier to detect such excesses when you've seen a similar movie many times before, he says, so you should try to get old. You should also try to read widely. François-Marie Wojcik, the doubt-filled French investor I mentioned earlier, showed me an 1891 novel by Émile Zola, L'Argent Money, which depicts a speculative frenzy on the Paris Stock Exchange in the 1860s. Zola provides an oddly familiar account of a disastrous bubble that ends in a banking collapse, even detailing how popular infatuation drives a stock beyond its maximum value to a point where it will inevitably fall. For Wojcik, a passionate student of history, Zola's novel provides an early example of these permanent patterns of wayward crowd behavior. Individually we're smart, says Wojcik. Collectively we're stupid. As a precaution, he stress-tests his opinions constantly in order to reaffirm or dismantle his convictions. I need to say, Francois, are you sure about this investment this morning? Let me check again. He has a wonderful French phrase to describe his neurotically watchful mindset, toujours rester en éveil. Always stay awake. Marx, too, never lets down his guard. Most investors grow complacent when times are good. If anything, his vigilance intensifies because he knows that everything changes, that the pendulum will not stop at one end of its arc, that cycles eventually prevail. As Marx explains, the risk is highest when risk tolerance is most extreme, a paradox that he calls the perversity of risk. Marx spends much of his time analyzing the mood and behavior of other financial players, looking to deduce where the markets stand in their cycle. He's particularly proud of a memo he wrote in 2007, a year before the financial crisis, that identified a slew of danger signs. These included idiotically loose lending standards for mortgages in the United States and the UK, a carefree willingness to finance undeserving companies, and a readiness to invest in risky bonds without covenant protections. Writing for emphasis in bold letters, he cautioned that times of laxness have always been followed eventually by corrections in which penalties are imposed. One way that Marx gauges the current investment environment is by gathering vignettes about stupid deals that are getting done. For example, in 2017, Argentina issued a 100-year bond with an annual yield of 9%. It was vastly oversubscribed, even though Argentina had defaulted on its debt 8 times in 200 years, most recently in 2014. It seemed a fine example of what Samuel Johnson called the triumph of hope over experience. Sure enough, when I interviewed Marx in 2020, he noted that Argentina had just defaulted for the 9th time. The symptoms of stupidity, overconfidence, greed, and low standards were particularly glaring in the run-up to the global financial crisis. Marx and his partner Karsh would compare notes and exclaim, "Look at this piece of crap. A deal like this shouldn't be able to get done, and the fact that it can get done means there's something wrong in the market." Such observations give Marx an impressionistic view of the market, not a numerical one. "All my processes are intuitive, instinctual gut," he says. "I just try to develop a sense. What's really going on in the world? And what are the important inferences from what you can observe?" To arrive at a conclusion, he asks himself questions such as, are investors appropriately skeptical and risk-averse, or are they ignoring risks and happily paying up? Are valuations reasonable relative to historical standards? Are deal structures fair to investors? Is there too much faith in the future? In a sense, says Marx, he's trying to predict the present, because, unlike the future, the present is knowable. What isn't knowable is when the cycle will turn. "I don't even think about the timing," he says. In the investment business, it's very hard to do the right thing, and it's impossible to do the right thing at the right time. The benefit of recognizing where we stand in the cycle is that it enables him to chart an appropriate course based on prevailing conditions, much as he'd drive more carefully on an icy road at night than on a sunny afternoon. We have to recognize the market for what it is, accept it, and act accordingly, says Marx. For example, when rich returns have made investors less afraid of losing money than missing out on lush gains, that's a signal to lower our expectations and proceed with caution. What does that entail in practical terms? It might involve shifting some assets from stocks to bonds, buying less aggressive stocks, or making sure that you won't need liquidity in the event that it suddenly disappears. "I'm not saying go to cash," says Marx. "All I'm saying is, if the value proposition in the market changes, your portfolio should change." To my mind, there's profound wisdom in this approach of seeing reality as it is, accepting it, and adapting to it. As Marx often says, the environment is what it is. We can't demand a more favorable set of market conditions, but we can control our response, turning more defensive or aggressive depending on the climate. This go-with-the-flow attitude grows directly out of the teachings on impermanence that Marx had studied at college. "You know change is going to occur despite your attempts to resist it," he says. "I think it should make you ease up and say, I'm not going to try to control the future. I'm not going to know the future. I'm going to try to prepare for an uncertain future." Investors often land themselves in trouble when there's a disconnect between their environment and their behavior, when they ignore or reject reality. In a 2006 memo, Marx quoted the ancient Taoist philosopher Lao Tzu. To be strong, you have to be like water. If there are no obstacles, it flows. If there is an obstacle, it stops. If a dam is broken, then it flows further. If a vessel is square, then it has a square form. If a vessel is round, then it has a round form. Because it is so soft and flexible, it is the most necessary and the strongest thing. For an investor, too, it's a strength to be like water, adjusting to whatever we encounter. It sounds so simple, but human nature conspires to make it difficult. Almost all of us are swayed by the mood of the crowd, and we struggle most to act rationally in extreme situations when the stakes are highest. When markets crashed in 2008, the investment herd panicked, as it always does. Celebration turned to horror, as cyclicality reasserted itself with a vengeance. How did Marx respond? He provided a master class in assessing and reacting to his environment with clear-eyed logic, and he led his company to pull off the investment coup of a lifetime. Most of the time, the end of the world doesn't happen. Months before the credit crisis arrived, Oaktree was already prepared for chaos. In early 2008, when most of the world was bullish and complacent, the firm completed the raising of $10.9 billion in assets to create the biggest distressed debt fund in history. Of all the cycles Marx has studied, none seems to him more predictable than the credit cycle. As he explains in The Most Important Thing, prosperity brings expanded lending, which leads to unwise lending, which produces large losses, which makes lenders stop lending, which ends prosperity, and on and on. He'd witnessed years of foolish lending from 2003 to 2007. When the inevitable losses piled up and lending screeched to a halt, he intended to profit from the distress. There's nothing quite like having cash when others are gasping for it. The credit crisis began with the sick joke of subprime mortgages and then metastasized. Mortgage lending froze. House prices tumbled. Commercial property prices tanked. Bear Stearns collapsed. Improbable disasters became a daily occurrence. Writing to Oaktree's shareholders on July 31, 2008, Marx reported that he still saw a shortage of beaten-down assets and suggested going slow until better bargains came along. Within weeks, the financial system began to disintegrate. In September, the U.S. government seized control of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Merrill Lynch was forced to sell itself to Bank of America. Lehman announced the largest bankruptcy filing in U.S. history. AIG had to be rescued with an $85 billion government loan. Even Goldman Sachs was hanging over the abyss. It was the greatest panic Marx had ever seen. But as the markets plunged and pessimism exploded, he turned bullish for the first time in years. On September 15, the day Lehman died, Oaktree began to amass an immense hoard of busted assets that nobody else would touch. Over the next 15 weeks, the firm, led by Marx and Karsh, invested an astounding $500 million to $600 million per week. This was the bet of Marx's career, the making or unmaking of his reputation. So you might imagine that he was certain of what he was doing. But when Lehman went under, it struck him that nobody knew what would happen. On September 19, he wrote a memo to Oaktree's clients that posed an unanswerable question, which somehow had to be answered. Will the financial system melt down, or is this merely the greatest down cycle we've ever seen? My answer is simple. We have no choice but to assume that this isn't the end, but just another cycle to take advantage of. With characteristic dry humor, he added, most of the time, the end of the world doesn't happen. When I ask what made him shift his stance from defensive to aggressive in mid-September, Marx replies, the world went to hell. Assets were being given away. Nobody had any faith that the world would even exist tomorrow, and there were no buyers for any assets. It was a perfect storm of circumstances for disaster. Marx never thinks of the future as a single predetermined scenario that's bound to occur. He views it instead as a distribution of different possibilities. His standard approach is to assign probabilities to each of these alternative futures. But in this case, the uncertainty was so extreme that there was no point even trying to assign probabilities for the array of possible outcomes. He found it more helpful to simplify his decision-making by thinking of the situation in binary terms. I think you can reduce it to either the world ends or it doesn't. And if it doesn't end and we didn't buy, then we didn't do our job. That made it awfully straightforward. But as the markets continued to crash and financial pillars crumbled, few people agreed with him. Some of the best investors he knows were just shell-shocked. They were saying, it's going to melt down. Marx knew how close we were to the edge. He could envision outcomes in which dominoes kept falling, and we ended up with mass unemployment and societal disaster. How bad is bad? You can't say what the worst case could be. Anarchy, riots, starvation. Then, in mid-October, he had an unforgettable experience that strengthened his contrarian conviction. One of Oaktree's funds made leveraged investments in high-yield debt, borrowing so that it could bet $5 for every dollar it held in equity capital. The fund owned senior loans that were relatively low risk. Over the previous 30 years, Oaktree's average default rate for debt of this type had been just 1% a year. But prices fell so far below historical norms that Oaktree now faced the threat of a margin call. Marx contacted clients and asked them to put up more equity, which enabled the fund to have its leverage and avert the margin call. But prices kept plunging, so he had to ask them to contribute more money. It should have been a no-brainer. If they didn't step up, they'd lock in their losses at these catastrophic prices. But Marx met with a pension fund manager, who kept asking what would happen to Oaktree's bonds under more and more extreme circumstances. Each time Marx answered with a reassuring fact, he was met with the same panic-stricken response. What if it's worse than that? Marx raced back to his office and dashed off a memo titled, "The Limits of Negativism." As he contemplated that meeting, he had a revelation. For decades, he'd warned investors to maintain their skepticism when optimism was so abundant that no story was too good to be true. But pessimism had reached such dire levels that investors now acted as if no story was too bad to be true. For a rational skeptic, the point is not to be permanently pessimistic. It's to question what everyone believes to be true, whether it's too positive or too negative. Explaining his epiphany, he wrote, "Skepticism calls for pessimism when optimism is excessive. But it also calls for optimism when pessimism is excessive." Thus Howard Marks, the eternal worrier, became virtually the only optimist on Wall Street. Going against the crowd in the midst of total panic, when everyone, convinced that things can only get worse, requires an uncommon level of intellectual clarity and imperturbability. But when I ask if he found the crisis painful, Marx replies flatly, "I don't remember it being difficult." Was he always unemotional? Yeah. Knowing that he's been married twice, I wonder if this aspect of his character drives his wife crazy. "Yeah, especially my first wife," he says. "I think I've done a better job with it more recently." It also helped that he and his Oaktree partner, Karsh, talked constantly, supporting each other and making sure they were moving at the right speed. While Marx provided guidance on the big picture, Karsh and his team did the nitty-gritty work of valuing assets. 2 or 3 years earlier, private equity firms had used massive leverage to buy high-quality businesses at exorbitant valuations. Oaktree now bought the senior debt of these companies for a pittance. In some cases, Oaktree would break even if these businesses proved to be worth one-fifth of what the buyout firms had paid. I always look at things in terms of, where's the mistake? Is the mistake in buying or not buying? He says Marx, it didn't take an enormous leap of faith to conclude that these were good buys. The most spectacular score came from Oaktree's $100 million investment in Peer Foods, which it bought out of bankruptcy in 2008. Reborn as Advanced Peer Foods, it became a nationwide leader in packaged sandwiches and was acquired by Tyson Foods in 2017. Oaktree made about $2.2 billion over 8 years, a 23-fold gain on its invested capital. In all, Oaktree wagered about $10 billion in the depths of the crisis. Marx estimates the gains from those investments at $9 billion, the biggest windfall in the company's history. As its largest shareholders, nobody profited more than Marx and Karsh. But there was also the sheer pleasure of outthinking others and being right. As Marx says, we have bet and we have won. The question is, do you push the limits? In our conversations and in his writings, Marx returns repeatedly to a handful of themes that have obsessed him for decades. As I see it, 5 critical ideas come up again and again. The importance of admitting that we can't predict or control the future. The benefits of studying the patterns of the past and using them as a rough guide to what could happen next. The inevitability that cycles will reverse and reckless excess will be punished. The possibility of turning cyclicality to our advantage by behaving countercyclically. The need for humility, skepticism, and prudence in order to achieve long-term financial success in an uncertain world. Life is so complex that it's useful to internalize a small core of simple and robust insights that can lend order to our diffuse thinking. All 5 of these ideas have tremendous utility for any investor looking to navigate the unknowable future. But in synthesizing what I've learned from Marx, I can't help thinking that one lesson in particular has such far-reaching implications that I need to make it central to my view of the world. For me, that tenet is the one he learned at college more than 50 years ago. Everything is impermanent. The financial markets provide us with many examples of this Buddhist teaching. The Asian economic miracle was followed by the Asian financial crisis of 1997. The dot-com mania of the late 1990s was followed by the crash of 2000. The housing bubble was followed by the credit crisis, which was followed by an epic bull market that began in 2009. Then, in 2020, the market dropped 34% in 23 days before surging almost 40% in the weeks that followed. If the Buddha had been a hedge fund manager, he might have pointed out that change itself is not ultimately the problem. Rather, we doom ourselves to suffer, both in investing and life, when we expect or yearn for things to stay the same. The real problem is this habit of clinging to or relying on what cannot last. As Buddhism teaches, we need to acknowledge the transience of all worldly phenomena so we won't be surprised or dismayed when change occurs. Shunryu Suzuki said, "If we cannot accept this teaching that everything changes, we cannot be in composure." Financially, the inevitability of change has important implications. For a start, we need to acknowledge that the current economic climate and market trajectory are temporary phenomena, just like everything else. So we should avoid positioning ourselves in such a way that we're dependent on their continuing along the same path. As Marx notes, investors repeatedly make the mistake of overestimating the longevity of the market's upswings and downturns. They forget that nothing lasts forever. Likewise, many home buyers ruined themselves during the financial crisis by taking on too much debt in the belief that house prices would continue to rise from here to eternity. The moral: never bet the farm against the inexorable forces of change. The recognition that all things are transient can fill you with a destabilizing sense that your life, and everything you cherish, is hopelessly precarious. It's tempting to live in denial, but it's prudent to acknowledge that we're skating on thin ice and can never be sure when it might crack. This awareness doesn't mean that we should hide at home forever, or that we should sit permanently on cash, refusing to take any risk. Both in markets and life, the goal isn't to embrace risk or eschew it, but to bear it intelligently while never forgetting the possibility of an unpleasant outcome. It's not an easy balance to achieve. In the darkest days of 2008, Marx had to keep reminding himself to resist his tendency to worry. If I overdo it, then I'm not doing my job for my clients because they didn't hire me to be a chicken. They want me to be a safe investor, but not a chicken. When taken too far, he adds, risk avoidance condemns you to return avoidance. Fortunately, we're not powerless in the face of change. There are many ways to make ourselves less vulnerable. Instead of trying to predict the unpredictable, Marx suggests that we focus on building unfragile portfolios and unfragile lives that are unlikely to collapse even in dire conditions. What does that mean for regular investors? Avoid a lot of debt and leverage, and don't let your dreams of a bonanza lead you to expose yourself to the possibility of a catastrophe, he says. Not trying to maximize is an important component in preparing for what life may throw at you, and that's true in investing and living. So the question is, do you push the limits? That question applies not just to investing, but to spending. Financial independence doesn't come from making or having a lot of money, says Marx. You know what it comes from. Spending less than you make. Living within your means. It's important to know that your antifragility comes from the extent to which you are not at the limit. The trouble is, we tend to forget this when we're thriving, or when we're watching others thrive while we lag behind. So we edge closer to our limits and eventually stray beyond them. Marx adds that we also need to recognize our financial and psychological fragility. You better be scared in the sense of acknowledging the possibility of bad things happening and being realistic about your own ability to withstand bad outcomes. He warns against macho claims that we won't mind if the stock market plunges. What normally happens when it goes down a third is that people panic and they sell, and they turn that downward fluctuation into a permanent loss, which is the worst thing you can do. It's vital, then, to be honest with ourselves about how much risk we can handle. If you take on too much, it will overwhelm your emotional resilience, and you will be forced to do the wrong thing even if nothing else transpires against you, like a margin call or a need to buy bread. There's a Buddhist quality to this habit of seeing reality as it is, without aversion or self-delusion. One of the greatest texts of Buddhism is the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha's discourse on mindfulness as a means to nirvana. He explains that the path to awakening requires us to become ever mindful of whatever presents itself to us, to observe with detachment as all things, including our thoughts, feelings, and sensory perceptions, arise and pass away. Freedom comes from clearly knowing that everything is ephemeral and training ourselves to stop grasping at what is inherently unstable. The Buddha repeats the same refrain 13 times, and one abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. This idea of non-attachment can sound cold or unnatural, but a recognition of impermanence has its benefits. For one, it's not just the good stuff, our youthful beauty, our loved ones, economic booms and bull markets, that will fade away. The bad stuff, emotional and physical pain, lousy political leaders, recessions, and pandemics, will also pass. Given that everything changes, we shouldn't get too carried away when times are good or too despondent when they're bad. A sense of impermanence can also inspire us to value and nurture our relationships, since we don't know how long any of us will be here, and to live more fully now. In his book The Science of Enlightenment, Shinzen Young writes of learning to experience the world with radical fullness, by focusing on every moment with extraordinary concentration, sensory clarity, and equanimity. You can dramatically extend life, not by multiplying the number of your years, but by expanding the fullness of your moments. VII. Now in his 70s, Marx has a keen sense of his own impermanence. His father lived to 101, so he may have inherited a genetic edge. Even so, he knows that the odds are against his being immortal. At this stage of life, he reflects increasingly on whether he's conducted himself admirably, not least in the way he's treated colleagues and clients. What you accomplish in life is not the only important thing. It's also important how you do it, he says. Maybe I'm insecure, but to me, it's very important that I'm acknowledged to have led a good life. He delights in Oaktree's returns, but he's also proud of its reputation for integrity and of his relationship with his co-founder, Karsh. Marx says they've never argued in 3 decades of working together. What does he hope to achieve in the years to come? I don't have any grand ambitions, says Marx. My life is terrific. I want to be a good husband, father, grandfather. And I want to keep seeing things in the investment world that other people don't see, and describing them clearly for my clients. He plans to work indefinitely because he finds it intellectually rewarding, not because he has an unquenchable thirst for money or status. He recalls his Japanese studies professor explaining a Buddhist teaching that you have to break the chain of getting and wanting, an aimless cycle of craving that leads inevitably to suffering. Perhaps, but Marx acknowledges that amassing wealth has given him freedom and security and made him less afraid. So far, at least, becoming a billionaire doesn't seem to have caused him a whole lot of suffering. Looking back on his lucky life, he has the humility to recognize that his talent alone was never enough, that so much had to break in his favor for him to achieve this level of success. That knowledge helps to protect him from the pride that goeth before a fall. For now, Marx is about as close as anyone gets to being a master of the universe. But if there's one thing he knows for sure, it's that change will come, and all of us will need to adapt. Chapter 4: The Resilient Investor. How to build enduring wealth and survive the wildness that lies in wait. The real trouble with this world of ours is not that it is an unreasonable world, nor even that it is a reasonable one. The commonest kind of trouble is that it is nearly reasonable, but not quite. Life is not an illogicality, yet it is a trap for logicians. It looks just a little more mathematical and regular than it is. Its exactitude is obvious, but its inexactitude is hidden. Its wildness lies in wait. G.K. Chesterton. As a young investment analyst at Société Générale in Paris in the 1960s, Jean-Marie Eviat had no idea what he was doing. His bosses indoctrinated him in the conventional stock-picking strategy of their era. Basically, their game was to trade actively the big stocks in the index, and that was all, he says. Like everyone around him, he obediently followed this respectable path to mediocre returns. As he would later observe, it's much warmer inside the herd. Eviat began to stray in 1968 after the bank posted him to New York. That summer, he was biking in Central Park with 2 French students from Columbia Business School. They told him about Benjamin Graham, who developed the discipline of value investing while teaching there in the 1920s. Eviat read his book Security Analysis and The Intelligent Investor, and instantly saw the light. He compares his discovery of Graham to the religious conversion of Paul Claudel, a French writer who found God spontaneously while standing in Notre Dame Cathedral in 1886. I was illuminated by Ben Graham's approach. I had found what I was looking for. Evia tried to convince his bosses to let him invest according to his new beliefs, but they hadn't heard of Graham and couldn't see the attraction of his alien philosophy. So Evia kept playing the game the old way. In all, he says, I wasted 15 years of my professional life. Finally, at the age of 39, he was set free. The bank made him the manager of Sogen International, a mutual fund so small and obscure that nobody cared what he did with it. When Evia took charge in 1979, the fund had only $15 million in assets. Based in Manhattan, he worked alone for years, relishing the lack of interference from his corporate overlords back in France. His new investment strategy was built on one all-important insight that he drew from the intelligent investor. Because the future is uncertain, you want to minimize your risk, says Evia. Like most great truths, it is so simple that it's easy to miss its significance, to gloss over its surface without internalizing its far-reaching implications. It was a lesson that Graham had learned from harrowing experience. Born in London in 1894, he grew up in a prosperous household in New York, supported by a family business that imported porcelain from Europe. But Graham's father died at 35, leaving his widow to raise 3 sons on her own. The business collapsed, so she converted their home into a boarding house, which also failed. To make matters worse, she borrowed money to buy shares and was cleaned out in the panic of 1907, when the stock market lost nearly half its value within weeks. Graham, who had grown up with a cook, a maid, and a governess, later recalled the shame at our disgrace when the family was forced to sell its possessions in a public auction. These childhood memories alone could have explained Graham's fixation on how to achieve resilience in the face of uncertainty. But in the years that followed, he confronted a series of calamities: World War I, the crash of 1929, and the Great Depression. After making a fortune as a money manager in the 1920s bull market, he lost 70% from 1929 to 1932. These experiences led him to a disturbing realization: the future of security prices is never predictable. Forged in fire, Graham constructed an investment credo that prioritized survival. He summed it up in the final chapter of The Intelligent Investor, which was written in the wake of the Holocaust. In the old legend, the wise men finally boiled down the history of mortal affairs into the single phrase, "This too will pass." Confronted with a like challenge to distill the secret of sound investment into 3 words, we venture the motto, margin of safety. Roman 2. Graham explained that a margin of safety could be attained by buying stocks and bonds at a favorable discount to their appraised value. That gap between price and value would provide a cushion to absorb the impact of an investor's own miscalculations, worse than average luck, and the unknown conditions of the future. It was a worldly wise strategy, built on a recognition of human frailty and the hazards of history. We make mistakes. We have bad luck. The future is unknown. Graham concluded that buying undervalued assets would give investors a better chance for profit than for loss, but he warned that this was still no guarantee that a specific investment wouldn't go horribly wrong. The solution: diversification. Evia, like Graham, was a child of uncertainty. He was born in the French city of Poitiers in 1940, just months before Germany invaded the country. His wary, fretful, slightly mournful view of life was influenced by sermons he heard as a child, while visiting his grandmother's Roman Catholic church in the French countryside. Speaking to a community that had suffered the recent trauma of defeat, bloodshed, and bombing, the priest would say, "Don't count on being happy on this earth. This is a valley of tears. You can only be happy in the afterworld." Thus Evia was primed to accept Graham's warnings that investors must expect and withstand adversity. In Graham's heyday, there were so many distressed assets in the United States that he didn't need to look for bargains overseas. But EVA cloned and then modified the strategy for another era, scavenging globally for stocks that cost at least 30–40% less than his estimate of their value. He based his appraisals on a conservative view of what a reasonable acquirer might pay in cash for the entire company. To borrow Graham's phrase, this was an approach based not on optimism but on arithmetic. For good measure, EVA routinely owned more than 100 stocks. Buffett and Munger had the stomach to hold a more concentrated portfolio, but EVA couldn't bring himself to do it. "I'm too skeptical about my own skills," he admits, and too worried that it could just blow up. His strategy worked, and he earned a reputation for high returns with low risks. Business Week and Morningstar feted him. Financial planners and brokers flooded him with their clients' assets. He hired a team of analysts and launched 2 new funds. Still, he never lost his sense of trepidation. As his funds grew, EVA felt the burden of managing money for hundreds of thousands of investors saving for retirement or their children's education. "It's money they cannot afford to lose," he says. "If I screwed up, I was very aware of the fact that I was making daily life more difficult for the investors in my funds. That pushed me to try to be cautious." EVA's rigorous focus on valuation kept his shareholders safe. For example, in the late 1980s, investors were so infatuated with Japan that asset prices ceased to reflect economic reality. By 1989, Japan accounted for 45% of the world's stock market capitalization, more than the United States and the UK combined, and most of the world's largest companies were Japanese. EVA exited Japan entirely in 1988, unable to find a single Japanese stock that met his valuation requirements. The bubble burst in late 1989, and Japanese stocks fell into a decades-long death spiral. At its low in 2009, the Nikkei 225 stock index had lost more than 80% in 20 years. During one of our conversations, EVA marveled that, in 2020, the Japanese market was still 30% below where it was 30 years ago. In a preface to The Intelligent Investor, Buffett wrote, "To invest successfully over a lifetime does not require a stratospheric IQ, unusual business insights, or inside information. What's needed is a sound intellectual framework for making decisions, and the ability to keep emotions from corroding that framework." How did EVA measure up? His intellectual framework, with its time-tested emphasis on the margin of safety, was sound. He also had the emotional strength to distance himself from the crowd, resisting any temptation to relax his standards when others were gunning the engine. For a while, he enjoyed one other critical advantage. He had the institutional latitude to go his own way, partly because he worked nearly 4,000 miles from his firm's headquarters, and partly because his returns gave nobody cause to complain or meddle. These were prerequisites for outperformance. But as EVA would soon discover, there are forces that conspire almost irresistibly to produce fragility and humdrum returns. We need to understand those forces, because they are remorseless enemies of resilience. In this chapter, we'll see what it took for EVA and his brilliant successor, Matthew McLennan, to navigate that minefield, producing an outstanding record over more than 4 decades. Their thinking offers many lessons on how to build and keep a fortune over your investment lifetime. To lag is to suffer. EVA's troubles began in 1997. By then, he had an 18-year record of avoiding mishap and beating the market. In his worst year, 1990, Sogen International had lost a paltry 1.3%. Along the way, his assets under management had soared to $6 billion. Unexpectedly, the threat to his financial fortress came not from a market meltdown, but a frenzy of speculation. From January 1997 to March 2000, the tech-heavy Nasdaq index rose 290%, fueled by a mania for internet and telecom stocks. To appreciate the thrilling absurdity of those times, consider the rise and fall of the Globe.com. The social media site went public in 1998, saw its stock price surge 606% on its first day of trading, and was delisted by Nasdaq in 2001, when the stock was languishing below $1. Or consider the fate of eToys. The online retailer went public in May 1999 at $20 per share, peaked at $84 that October, and went bankrupt 18 months later. Or consider Cisco Systems. The networking firm's market value rocketed from $100 billion to $500 billion in less than 500 days, making it, briefly, the world's biggest company. Then the bubble burst, and the stock plunged 86%. EVA, a man who fretted for a living, refused to board the roller coaster. Analytically, it wasn't a hard decision, given the ludicrous valuations and the notorious difficulty of predicting which tech companies will endure and which will flame out. But he took the extreme position of owning no tech at all. It requires real bravery for fund managers to diverge radically from the market indexes because, if they're wrong, they can jeopardize their entire career. That's particularly unappealing if you're married, have kids, or just fancy the idea of preserving your luxurious lifestyle. An easier option is to underweight certain stocks or sectors instead of avoiding them entirely. The specter of career risk helps to explain why many funds hug the index, condemning themselves to unexceptional returns but sparing themselves exceptional grief. EVA, who has a streak of indomitable obstinacy, did not take the easy option. As a result, he lagged the market by miles for 3 long years while tech stocks went nuts. In 1998 alone, the Nasdaq gained 39.6%, and the MSCI World Index gained 24.3%, while SoGen International lost 0.3%. The following year, SoGen International roared back, returning 19.6%. Pretty good, right? Wrong. That year, the Nasdaq shot up 85.6%. EVA's relative returns looked pitiful in an era when any buffoon could hit the jackpot, and his shareholders weren't inclined to thank him for acting responsibly. On the contrary, his prudence started to seem like slow professional suicide. To lag is to suffer, says EVA. It becomes psychologically painful, but also financially painful. After 1 year, your shareholders are upset. After 2 years, they're furious. After 3 years, they're gone. Indeed, SoGen lost 70% of its shareholders in less than 3 years, and its assets under management dwindled from more than $6 billion to barely $2 billion. Understandably, his bosses were not amused. His employer, Société Générale, seldom fired anyone. If they thought you couldn't do the job anymore, they put you in a small office with nothing to do. Still, in 1999, he began to think the unthinkable: maybe they'll kick me out. The mutual fund business can be marvelously profitable. It's not capital intensive, and it boasts unusually high operating margins. The late Marty Whitman, a renowned investor with a gift for tactless truth-telling, once told me that fund managers are competitive in every way, except when it comes to lowering their fees. The executives who run mutual fund companies have strong incentives to keep gathering assets. They're not fools or villains. They're pragmatic business people who focus heavily on sales and marketing. An outperformer such as EVA was a prized asset in good times. But in bad times, it was easy to cast him as a zealot whose extremism placed everyone's bonuses at risk. If credulous investors wanted to buy .com stocks, why not give them what they wanted? Why not feed the ducks while they were quacking? The pressure was palpable. Evia heard that one senior executive had grumbled behind his back that he was half senile. Evia, who was only 59, reported the incident to his wife, Elizabeth, a battle-hardened investment banker.